Clara Bennett pressed both palms flat against the cold wash basin and stared at what the mirror showed her purple and yellow across her ribs. Older bruises gone greenish beneath fresh ones, a map of every time she had failed to disappear fast enough. She pulled the collar up, buttoned every button to her throat. Then she heard boots on the floorboards outside her door, slow, deliberate, and her whole body went rigid as a dead woman's. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 arrived in Harlan County, Virginia. The way most cruel things arrived quietly without warning, wrapped in something that looked almost beautiful. The heat came first. It pressed down on the Carter estate like a hand on the back of a neck, heavy and unyielding, baking the red clay soil until it cracked in long wandering lines between the rows of tobacco. The fields stretched wide in every direction, worked by men who moved slow in the thick air, their shirts dark with sweat before the morning bell had even finished ringing. The main house sat at the top of a long rise, white-painted and wide-porched, the kind of house that told you immediately who lived there and how long that family had been telling the county what was what. Nathaniel Carter had inherited that house at 31, buried his father in the churchyard behind it, and then 5 years later buried his wife Eleanor beside him. He was 36 now, and he ran the estate the way he had run his cavalry unit during the war, with precision, with economy, and with the particular coldness of a man who had learned not to lean too hard on anything that could be taken away. The servants knew to stay out of his direct path before 9 in the morning. The children, Thomas 8 and Annabelle 6, had learned to take their loudest games to the far side of the property. The neighboring families had long since stopped inviting him to their suppers, because Nathaniel Carter sat through 3 courses without saying 10 words, and if anyone pushed him for an opinion, he gave it with the flat, measured delivery of a man reading from a legal document. How was not cruel, he was simply sealed. Clara Bennett arrived on a Wednesday morning in early June, stepping down from the hired coach with a single trunk and a brown leather satchel held close against her body, like something she was not willing to let anyone else touch. She was 27 years old, with dark hair pulled up under a plain gray bonnet and a face that struck most people as quietly pretty. Not remarkable. Not the kind that made men turn twice in the street, but the kind that grew on you slowly. The kind with something watchful and careful behind the eyes that you only noticed if you were paying attention. Nathaniel had not been paying attention. He'd met her at the front steps for exactly 4 minutes, confirmed that her references from the Philadelphia household checked out, told her the children's schedule, and returned to his study. His housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, a wide, capable woman of 60, who had served the Carter family since Nathaniel's father's time, was the one who actually settled Clara in. She showed her the upstairs bedroom, the schoolroom, the pantry where she was welcome to take her meals if she preferred not to eat with the staff. She watched Clara set her satchel down very carefully on the bed, keeping her back to the room while she did it, and she made a mental note that said nothing specific and meant something. "You'll find the children difficult at first," Mrs. Aldridge told her. "Thomas has been running off tutors for 8 months. He's not a bad boy. He's a boy whose mother is dead and whose father doesn't know what to do about it." "I understand," Clara said. "Do you?" Clara turned then, and Mrs. Aldridge saw something in her face. Not the polished sympathy of a woman trained to say the right things, but something older and quieter. Something that recognized loss from the inside rather than the outside. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. "I believe I do." By the end of the first week, Thomas had thrown an ink pot at the schoolroom wall, refused to conjugate a single Latin verb, and told Clara directly that she would be gone before July. Clara picked up the rag, cleaned the ink off the wall, set the pot back on the desk, and said, "Sit down, Thomas." "I don't have to." "No, you don't. But you will, because I'm not going to fight with you, and I'm not going to leave, and standing there being angry takes more energy than sitting down and conjugating 3 verbs. Your choice." Thomas stared at her. He'd expected tears or fury or the pursed-mouthed disappointment the previous tutors had offered him like a weapon. He got none of those things. He sat down. He conjugated 4 verbs. He didn't throw anything the next day or the day after. By the end of the second week, Annabelle had claimed Clara's right hand as personal property during their afternoon walks, and told anyone who asked that Miss Clara smelled like lavender and knew 47 stories. The number was actually 23, but Annabelle had always favored generosity over accuracy. It was on a Thursday evening, the third week of June, that Nathaniel first noticed the collar. He'd come in from the south field later than usual, the kind of tired that lived in the shoulders and the back of the knees, and he'd stopped in the hallway outside the library because he could hear voices from the front sitting room. Clara's voice low and steady, and then Annabelle's high bright laugh, and then Thomas, who laughed less, but had apparently decided to tonight. He stood in the hallway and listened to his children laugh. He couldn't remember the last time that sound had come from inside his house without him having to consciously create the conditions for it. He stepped into the day, intending to simply observe, and Clara looked up from the book on her lap. She was sitting on the floor, not on the chair, with both children tucked close. Annabelle, leaning against her left shoulder, Thomas pretending not to lean against her right. "Mr. Carter," she said. She started to rise, the reflex of a woman trained in formal households. "Don't," he said. It came out shorter than he'd intended. "Don't get up." She settled back. Her hand went to the top button of her collar, not to unbutton it, just touching it, a small unconscious check, like a woman confirming that a door was still locked. He noticed it. He didn't know yet what he'd noticed. The heat in the third week of June was different from the heat of the first two. It had teeth. It came down with a personal quality, like it had decided to make the county its specific problem, and it did not relent after sundown the way the earlier heat had. It sat in the rooms of the Carter house long past midnight, thick and close, turning sleep into something you had to fight for. Clara fought for it every night. She'd slept badly for 4 years. She slept badly still in the Carter house, even though she was safer here than she had been anywhere since she was 22 years old. Safety, she had learned, did not automatically undo what fear had built in your body. Your nerves did not simply accept the news that things were different now. They kept their positions watchful and braced, waiting for the thing they'd been trained to expect. She woke at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, to the sound of the first summer storm rolling in off the mountains. Thunder far off, like a door slamming in some enormous house. She was sitting up before she knew she'd moved. She pressed both hands flat against the mattress. She counted a thing she'd learned to do, a way of dragging herself back into the room she was actually in, rather than the one she kept returning to involuntarily. 1, 2, 3. The quilt under her palms. 4, 5. The smell of beeswax and old wood. 6, 7. Rain on the window light and random. 8. She breathed. She was in the Carter house, in Harlan County, Virginia. She was a governess. She was 27 years old, and she was safe, and nobody was coming. She believed about half of that. She got up because lying back down would accomplish nothing useful, and pulled her heavy robe over her nightgown and went down the back stairs to the kitchen to heat water for tea. She did not light the main lamp. She worked by the low glow of the banked stove, filling the kettle by feel, setting it on the iron ring, pulling a mug from the shelf. She knew where everything was by now. She'd made a point of learning the kitchen in the first 3 days' exits layout, what was where, with the systematic efficiency of a woman who'd learned that knowing your exits was not paranoia, it was survival. The thunder rolled closer. She wrapped her hands around the empty mug and waited for the kettle. She did not hear Nathaniel come down the stairs. She heard him when he reached the kitchen doorway, because the third board from the bottom of the main stair creaked in a specific way, and she'd cataloged that too. She turned before he spoke, and in turning she moved too fast, and her robe swung open at the collar, and the lamplight from the hall caught the side of her neck. Nathaniel stopped. Clara caught the robe closed with one hand, quickly, the practiced speed of a woman who'd done this 1,000 times, fingers finding the lapels and pulling them together in a single smooth motion. But she wasn't fast enough. Not quite. He'd seen the edge of it. The lower edge of a bruise on the side of her neck, old enough to have gone yellow, not old enough to have disappeared entirely. The silence in the kitchen had a specific quality. The rain picked up against the window. The kettle began its low preliminary whistle. Mr. Carter, Clara said. Her voice was steady. She had worked for 4 years to make her voice steady in exactly these moments. I apologize if I woke you. I couldn't sleep. You didn't wake me, he said. How was in his shirt sleeves? No coat. The shirt open at the throat. A man who'd come downstairs in the middle of the night without expecting to encounter anyone, which meant he wasn't managing his appearance, which meant what she saw on his face was probably what he actually felt. And what she saw was not pity. It was not the wide, soft, devastated expression she'd learned to dread, the expression that required her to manage someone else's reaction to her pain on top of the pain itself. What she saw was something more controlled than that. Something that had gone very still and was thinking carefully before it moved. Sit down, Miss Bennett, he said. I'm fine standing. I'm not asking because you're not fine. I'm asking because I am going to say something, and I'd rather say it while we're both sitting at a table like two people having a reasonable conversation. She sat down. I took the kettle off the ring himself. She started to rise, and he shook his head, and he poured 2 mugs and set one in front of her, and sat down across the table with the other. The reference from Philadelphia, he said. The Hargrave family. I wrote to them when you first arrived. Standard practice. Mr. Hargrave wrote back 3 days ago. He looked at his mug. He speaks highly of your work. He also mentions that you left their employ somewhat suddenly, that you gave no notice. Clara said nothing. He doesn't say why. He seems like a man who decided it wasn't his business to say why. Nathaniel looked up at her. I'm asking you directly, not to pry, not to judge, because I have 2 children in this house, and I need to understand whether I'm putting them in the middle of something dangerous. You're not, Clara said. How can I know that? Because whatever happened to me, Mr. Carter, happened to me. It has nothing to do with Thomas or Annabelle, and I would put myself between them and any harm that came through that door before I would let it touch them. I think you know that by now, or I wouldn't still be here. He studied her. His eyes were gray, the kind of gray that changed with the light, and right now in the low lamplight, they were dark and very direct. The bruise on your neck, he said. Her jaw tightened. It's old. I can see that. Are there more? The question landed in the space between them and sat there. Clara set both palms flat on the table. She looked at the surface of the wood between her hands, the grain of it, the small scar where something hot had been set there years ago. Mr. Carter, she said carefully, I appreciate that you're asking out of concern rather than judgment. I'm going to ask you to leave it there. I am doing my job. I am not in immediate danger. The children are safe. That should be sufficient. Should be, he said. Is, she corrected. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once and drank his tea. They sat in the kitchen while the storm came in fully overhead, and neither of them spoke again, and in the morning it was as if the conversation had not happened, except that something had shifted slightly in the particular way that Nathaniel Carter positioned himself in whatever room Clara was also in. She noticed it on Friday. She noticed it again on Saturday. By Sunday, she had identified it clearly. He was positioning himself between her and the door, not obviously. Not the broad theatrical display she'd seen from men who wanted credit for their protection. It was small and almost thoughtless, the way a man angles his body when he's simply standing somewhere, habit or instinct, rather than decision. When they were in the same room, he stood nearer to the exit than she did. When they walked across the grounds to where the children were playing, he took the side that faced the road. She didn't know what to do with it. She'd spent 4 years ensuring that she needed no one to stand between her and anything. She'd learned to read rooms the way Nathaniel apparently read rooms, to clock the exits to track the movements of everyone within a certain radius. She'd developed a perfect quiet self-sufficiency that looked like calm and was actually something closer to a soldier's permanent alertness. She didn't need someone else to stand at the door, but she noticed him doing it, and her body noticed it differently than her mind did. Something in her ribcage loosened slightly for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. She told herself it meant nothing. On a Tuesday afternoon in late June, a man arrived at the front gate of the Carter estate. Mrs. Aldridge came to find Clara in the schoolroom, which was unusual enough that Clara looked up immediately. Mrs. Aldridge's face was arranged into an expression of perfect, deliberate neutrality, the kind of neutrality that takes effort. "There's a gentleman at the gate," Mrs. Aldridge said. "He's asking for a woman named Margaret Whitfield." Clara set down the book in her hands. The name landed in her chest like a key turning in a lock she'd thought she'd thrown into a river. "Did he say his name?" Clara asked. "Gave the name of Aldous Crane." Mrs. Aldridge watched Clara's face. "He says he's a solicitor, acting on behalf of a Mr. Gerald Whitfield." "Yes," Clara said. Her voice was entirely level. "I know who he is." "Should I send him away?" Clara looked at Thomas, who was bent over his arithmetic and pretending not to listen. She looked at Annabel, who had not yet learned to pretend, and was watching Clara with wide alert eyes. "Take the children to the garden," Clara told Mrs. Aldridge. "Tell them to stay with you until I come." She stood up, smoothed her skirt with both hands, not from vanity, from the need to have something physical to do with her hands before they could begin to shake, and said, "I'll speak with him myself. Miss Bennett. Please, Mrs. Aldridge, take the children." Aldous Crane was a short man with a very expensive coat and the particular polished meanness of someone who had learned to weaponize respectability. He was waiting just inside the front gate, not on the drive. He hadn't come far enough in to be technically a guest, but far enough in to establish that he was not going to be turned away easily. Clara came down the front steps and walked toward him at an even pace. She'd had 4 years to practice walking toward things she didn't want to face, and she was good at it. "Mr. Crane," she said. "Mrs. Whitfield." He tipped his hat with the precise minimum of courtesy required. My. You've landed well, haven't you, Virginia Plantation? Respectable household, a long way from Philadelphia." "My name," Clara said, "is Clara Bennett. I suggest you use it. I'm afraid that's not legally accurate." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "Your husband has been most eager to locate you, Mrs. Whitfield. 14 months is quite a disappearance. He's been very worried about your welfare." "I imagine he has," Clara said. She did not take the envelope. "This is a notice," Crane said, extending it further, "requiring your return to the marital home. Mr. Whitfield has retained legal counsel in 3 states. He's also made inquiries with the county magistrate here. Your employer." He glanced toward the house. "Maybe receiving a visit as well. It would be cleaner for everyone, I should think, if you simply came quietly." "I will not," Clara said. Crane blinked. He'd clearly expected more disruption, tears, or flight, or frantic negotiation. He hadn't expected the flat declarative simplicity of those 3 words delivered without a tremor. "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband has legal rights." "My husband," Clara said, and her voice did not rise and did not waver, "has a pattern. He finds me. He sends men like you first, because he likes to watch what that does to me. He's done it twice before. In Philadelphia, and before that in Baltimore. I left those places. I will not leave this one." "You don't have a choice. I have the only choice that matters. I have decided not to go, and I have decided to tell you plainly, I will not go. Whatever legal machinery your employer wishes to engage it. I will be here." Crane stared at her. He reassembled his expression into something colder. "I wonder if your employer knows," he said, "that he's harboring a woman who abandoned her lawful husband. A woman with no legal standing, no family to speak for her, and a rather embarrassing history that I imagine he'd be most interested to." "He knows," said a voice behind Clara. She turned. Nathaniel Carter was standing at the top of the front steps. He had come out of the house. She hadn't heard the door, and he was standing with his hands in his pockets and his weight balanced, and his face showing absolutely nothing. But his voice when he spoke again was something else entirely. "He knows," Nathaniel said, coming down the steps at an unhurried pace. "Considerably more than you seem to believe. And he is not interested in whatever you've come to say." He stopped beside Clara, not in front of her, beside her shoulder adjacent, and looked at Crane with the gray eyes that Clara had learned did not require raised voices to communicate the full spectrum of what they meant. "You're on my land. You've delivered your message. I'd suggest you go." Crane looked between them. He did a quick recalibration, the kind that small men with expensive coats do when they realize that the power in the room has rearranged itself without their input. "Mr. Carter," he said, "you should be aware that—" "I'm aware," Nathaniel said, "that you're still here." Crane left. They stood in the drive for a moment after the gate closed. Clara was looking at the gate. She became aware that her hands were shaking, and she pressed them against her sides. "You heard," she said. "From the study window," Nathaniel said. "I didn't intend to eavesdrop. I heard raised voices." His voice, not mine. "No," he said. "Not yours." She turned to look at him, and found him already looking at her, and the expression on his face was still carefully controlled. The man was made of controlled expressions, but underneath the control, there was something that looked oddly like fury. Not at her. Not the confused, destabilizing fury that she'd learned to brace for. A different kind. Directed outward. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. He seemed to notice it at the same moment she did, and he didn't correct it. "How long has he been looking for you?" She looked back at the gate. "He never stopped," she said. Mrs. Aldridge fed the children supper early and got them to bed without mentioning the visit at the gate. She was a woman of extraordinary practical competence. Mrs. Aldridge, the kind who understood that there were times when the best thing you could do for a household was to take the specific thing that needed handling away from the people who couldn't afford to be distracted by it right now. After the children were upstairs, she came to the back sitting room where Clara was not the formal parlor. The smaller room, the one that had always felt more like a family room than a company room, and set a plate of food on the table beside her without being asked, then sat across from her and folded her hands. "I've known about the bruises since the second day," Mrs. Aldridge said. "I do the laundry." Clara said nothing. "I didn't ask because you weren't ready to talk about it, and because you were doing your job beautifully, and because Thomas had already stopped throwing things at the walls, which frankly I considered enough of a miracle that I didn't want to disturb whatever you were doing." She looked at Clara directly. "His name is Gerald Whitfield." "Yes." "He's the one who did it." "Yes." "Has he put his hands on you since you left?" "No, I've been careful." "Until now." Clara looked at the plate of food. Her appetite had not returned, but she picked up the fork because refusing would be unkind. "He found me eventually in Philadelphia," she said. "And before that in Baltimore. I don't know how. He has resources. He has a solicitor who has done this twice before. I always believed that if I just moved far enough—" She stopped. "I don't know why I thought Virginia would be different." "Because you wanted it to be," Mrs. Aldridge said simply. "Because everyone has to land somewhere eventually." Clara set the fork down. "I should have told Mr. Carter before taking the position. I should have been honest about—" "You should have been safe," Mrs. Aldridge said, with the quiet, hard certainty of a woman who had lived long enough to know which of those things was more important. "The rest is details." Nathaniel came to find Clara after 9 o'clock when the house had settled, and the only sounds were the insects outside and the distant complaint of the nightjars. He knocked on the sitting room doorframe. The door was open. He knocked anyway. Another thing she added to the mental accounting she kept of what kind of man he was, and looked at her from the threshold. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know before I ask it that either answer is acceptable to me, and I mean that plainly." Clara looked at him. "Ask. Do you want to leave? I can arrange an escort. Letters of reference. Money don't argue. It would be a loan if you prefer. I don't care what you call it. I can have you in Richmond by end of the week, and from there wherever you decide to go." He paused. "Or you can stay. Stay and let me help you deal with this the other way." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "What is the other way?" she asked. "I know the county magistrate. I know 3 lawyers in Richmond who are better than whatever Whitfield has retained. I know how property law works in this state, and I know how marital law works, and I know where every piece of those laws is softer than it looks." His voice was still the measured, factual voice she'd heard him use to discuss crop yields and fence repairs, but there was something underneath it that wasn't measured at all. "I'm not offering this because I pity you. I want to be clear about that. I've watched you for 3 weeks. You are not a woman who needs pity. You need someone who is not afraid to stand in the same direction you're already standing." Clara looked at him for a long time. She had been doing everything alone for 4 years. She had been alone before that too, in the marriage alone, in the particular and specific way of a person surrounded by someone who has made themselves your whole world, and then made the world a very small and very dangerous place. She had learned not to lean on anyone. She had learned it the way you learn things from consequences, the kind of learning that lives in your body and not just your mind. She said, "Why?" "Because," Nathaniel said, and for the first time since she'd arrived in this house, the control in his face slipped just slightly, just enough to show the edge of something real underneath it. Thomas laughed today. Full-throated, ridiculous 7-year-old laughter, the kind I haven't heard from him since before his mother died. He was laughing at something you said. "And Annabelle." He stopped, jaw working. "Annabelle told me at dinner that Miss Clara knows how to make the scary things smaller. That's what she said. That you taught her to count when she's frightened." Clara's throat tightened. "I know what it cost you to teach her that," he said quietly. "I know you didn't learn it out of books." The sitting room was very still. "I'm not leaving," Clara said. Something in Nathaniel's face settled. "All right," he said. "And Mr. Carter." Her voice was steady, but she let him hear what was underneath it. Not weakness, not need, but something she hadn't let herself speak out loud in a very long time. "Thank you." He nodded once, started to turn. "Nathaniel," she said. He turned back. "Whatever you're planning to do about Crane, about Whitfield, I want to know about it. I'm not going to be managed. I'm not going to be protected around and be the last person to know what's happening to my own life." The edge of something moved across his face that might on a man with a different history have been a smile. "Wouldn't have it any other way," he said. After he left, Clara sat in the back sitting room for a long time, listening to the nightjars and the faint sound of the wind moving through the tobacco fields. The summer heat was still there pressing at the windows, but inside the room the air had cooled slightly, and she could breathe without effort. She thought about Gerald Whitfield, who had found her twice, and was trying to find her a third time. She thought about Aldous Crane, and his expensive coat, and his envelope, and the way he'd said came quietly, like it was a reasonable thing to ask a person. She thought about Nathaniel Carter standing at the top of the front steps. "He knows." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Not to suppress tears, she hadn't cried properly in 3 years. She wasn't sure the machinery for it still worked, but because she needed to do something with the feeling that had no shape yet, that was too large to sit in her chest without some acknowledgement. Then she straightened, put both hands in her lap. Thought with the cold, careful precision she'd developed over 4 years of outrunning a man who never entirely stopped running. Gerald Whitfield thought she was the same woman he'd married. He thought she was the woman who'd learned to make herself small, to absorb every blow without fighting back, because fighting back made things worse. To count herself lucky when the bad spells passed and pretend they didn't leave marks. He had not met the woman she'd become in the years since she'd left him. He had not met the woman who had decided sitting in a kitchen in Virginia at 3 in the morning with a storm rolling in overhead, and a man across the table who saw her clearly and didn't look away, that she was done running. Clara Bennett, because that was her name, her real name. The name she'd chosen and intended to keep, looked at the closed sitting room door and thought, let him come. The morning after, Aldous Crane came through the gate. Clara woke before the sun and lay still for exactly 11 seconds, counting the familiar details of the ceiling above her, anchoring herself in the room the way she always did. Then she got up dressed and went to work. That was the thing people never understood about surviving. It didn't stop the daily requirements of living. The children still needed breakfast. Thomas still had his Latin. Annabelle had decided that Tuesday was the appropriate day to learn fractions, and she approached fractions with the same cheerful ferocity she brought to everything, which meant Clara needed her wits fully present and not trailing behind her in the events of the previous evening. She was halfway through explaining numerators when Thomas looked up from his own work and said without preamble, "Who was the man at the gate yesterday?" Clara kept her eyes on Annabelle's slate. A man on business. He didn't look like a businessman. He looked like the kind of man Father doesn't like. Thomas, Clara said. Father has a specific face he makes. For tax collectors and lawyers, and people who come to tell him things he doesn't want to hear. Thomas chewed his pencil, a habit she'd been working to break for 2 weeks with zero measurable success. He had that face when he came back inside. Your father handles a great deal of county business, Clara said. Men on business come to the gate regularly. Not ones who make you go pale. Clara set down the chalk and looked at him directly. Thomas was 8 years old with his father's gray eyes and his mother's quick, unsettling perceptiveness, and he was watching her with the particular attention of a child who had spent a year reading the adults around him, the way other children read primers, carefully looking for the thing underneath the thing. I'm fine, Thomas, she said. I didn't say you weren't. He picked up his pencil again. I just wanted you to know that I noticed. He went back to his work. Annabelle, who had been watching this exchange with large round eyes, patted Clara's hand once, and then also returned to her fractions. Clara stood at the front of the schoolroom and breathed. She thought these children are going to undo me completely, and I mean that in the best possible way. Nathaniel was gone from the house by the time she brought the children down for the midday meal. Mrs. Aldridge said he'd ridden out early headed toward town and hadn't said when he'd be back. Clara did not ask follow-up questions. She ate with the children, listened to Annabelle's detailed account of a dream involving a horse that could do arithmetic, helped Thomas locate a book he'd misplaced behind the chest of drawers in his room, and spent the afternoon in the schoolroom, feeling the particular draining tension of a woman waiting for something without knowing what shape it would take. He came back at 4 o'clock. She heard the horse in the yard and kept herself in her chair. She was not going to be a woman who went to windows to watch for a man's return. She had too much dignity for that, and also too much genuine wariness about what it would mean if she were. But when Mrs. Aldridge appeared in the schoolroom doorway at 4:30 and said, Mr. Carter would like a word with you in the study when you have a moment. Clara set down her pen with a hand that was slightly steadier than she expected. She released the children to the garden. She knocked on the study door. Come in, Nathaniel said. Howe was standing behind his desk coat, still on papers spread open in front of him, with the focused disorder of a man who'd come in and immediately started working. He looked up when she entered. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand. He accepted this without comment and turned one of the papers toward her. I spoke with Henry Marsh this morning. He's the best property attorney in the county. I've also sent a letter to a colleague in Richmond who specializes in matrimonial law. Clara looked at the paper. It was covered in dense legal notation, Nathaniel's handwriting fast and angular in the margins. You went to a lawyer without telling me, she said. I told you last night I was going to handle this. You told me you were going to do something. That is not the same as specific prior agreement. She looked up from the paper. I said I didn't want to be managed. He had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. It was a small crack in the surface, quickly smoothed, but she caught it. You're right, he said. I moved faster than I should have. I'm accustomed to making decisions quickly. So am I, Clara said. They just tend to be decisions about my own life. Fair. He pulled the paper back and set it squarely in front of himself. Then let me tell you what Marsh said, and we'll go from there. She sat down. He talked for 20 minutes. He talked the way he seemed to do everything without waste, without ornamentation, hitting the relevant points with the precision of a man who'd spent years in situations where imprecision had consequences. Marsh had confirmed what Nathaniel had suspected. Virginia law in 1817 did not make it easy for a woman to resist a husband's legal claim, but it was not impossible. There were conditions. There were specific circumstances under which a court would consider the wife's testimony. There was crucially a judge in the county circuit who had recently presided over 2 similar cases and who had in both instances given more weight to documented evidence than Marsh had expected from a man of his generation. He'll need evidence, Nathaniel said. Not just your word, not just mine. I know that. Do you have anything, letters, records, anything that documents what happened? Clara was quiet for a moment. I kept a journal, she said. For the first 2 years of the marriage, I stopped because she chose her words carefully, because he found it once. After that, it wasn't safe to keep one. But I wrote down everything before that. Dates, incidents. I described things precisely. A lawyer once told me in Baltimore that if I ever found the right judge in the right county, that journal would matter. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. Where is it? She touched the leather satchel on her lap, the one she'd carried off the coach on her first day, the one she never let out of her sight. I see, he said. I've carried it for 4 years, she said. I didn't know why exactly. I thought about burning it more than once. It seemed like keeping it meant I hadn't finished with it yet, hadn't finished deciding. Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. You've finished deciding, he said. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. Yes, she said. The journal went into the study safe that evening. Clara watched Nathaniel close the heavy iron door and turn the key, and something she'd been carrying in her ribs since Baltimore, a specific concentrated tension that had no name, but that she could locate precisely if she pressed 2 fingers below her left collarbone, loosened by a single significant degree. The journal was not gone. But it was somewhere other than her body. That was more than she'd managed in 4 years. What she hadn't anticipated was the county. Harlan County, in the summer of 1817, was not a large place in terms of gossip capacity, but it made exceptional use of what it had. By the following Sunday, the news that a woman with a complicated past had been located at the Carter estate, this fact having traveled from Crane to whatever contacts Crane maintained in town, and from there, through the networks that small communities sustain with the devotion of a religious practice, had reached roughly 4 out of every 5 households in the surrounding area. Clara discovered this at church. She went with Mrs. Aldridge and the children, as she had the 2 previous Sundays. She sat in the same pew in the same position, wearing the same Sunday dress, with the same high collar that everyone had by now accepted, without comment, as simply the way the Carter governess dressed, a personal preference, perhaps a fashion from wherever she'd come from. This Sunday, 3 women she'd spoken with pleasantly, on both previous occasions, looked directly at her, and then looked away. A 4th, the wife of a county commissioner, whose name Clara had not yet memorized, leaned toward her companion behind a gloved hand, and said something at a volume intended to carry. Clara heard the word abandoned. She heard husband. She did not catch the rest, but she didn't need to. She sat straight. She kept her eyes forward. Beside her, Annabelle slipped a small hand into hers without being asked, because Annabelle had inherited her father's instinct for the shape of a room, and at 6 years old, she had already developed the grace to respond to it without making it worse. Thomas on Clara's other side said nothing. But when they stood for the opening hymn, he positioned himself on her left with the squared shoulders of a boy doing a thing he'd decided about and not announcing it. And Clara thought for the 2nd time in a week that these children were going to undo her completely. After the service, she was standing near the church steps, when a woman she recognized, Mrs. Patterson, whose husband ran the county feed store, and who had always previously greeted her with genuine warmth, walked past without meeting her eyes. A man named Dorsey, who she'd overheard complimenting her teaching methods to Nathaniel just 2 weeks ago, turned slightly away when she approached. The shape of it was not new to her. She recognized it. Social recontraction, the way communities closed around a person marked by inconvenient circumstances. How the warmth withdrew first from the eyes, and then from the body, and finally from the physical space, so that you found yourself standing in a radius of deliberate not seeing. She'd experienced it in Baltimore. She'd experienced it in Philadelphia. She'd learned to hold her spine straight through it. What she hadn't expected was the voice from the bottom of the steps. Miss Bennett. Loud, deliberate, the voice of a woman projecting into a crowd. Clara turned. Mrs. Harlow was 65 if she was a day, the widow of a former circuit court judge, a woman whose social standing in Harlan County was the kind that had been accruing compound interest for 4 decades. She was small, sharp-eyed, and dressed in uncompromising black bombazine, and she was walking toward Clara with the direct, unhurried pace of a person who did not generally require the crowd to part for her because the crowd had long since learned to do it preemptively. I was hoping to speak with you. Mrs. Harlow said, in the same carrying voice, in the same deliberate public register. She took Clara's hand and pressed it firmly between both of hers. "I've heard such wonderful things about your work with the Carter children. Nathaniel's boy was half wild last winter. You've clearly done remarkable work. We are so glad to have you in the county." Silence spread outward from them in a circle. Mrs. Harlow was still holding Clara's hand and smiling at her with the serene, devastating force of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and had decided to do it. "Thank you, Mrs. Harlow," Clara said, and kept her voice from wavering through sheer experience. "You must come to tea," Mrs. Harlow said. "Thursday if you can manage it. I insist." She patted Clara's hand once firmly like a punctuation mark, and then raised her eyes to the crowd in a way that managed to look completely casual, while simultaneously being one of the more effective territorial communications Clara had ever witnessed. 3 of the women who'd been not looking straightened slightly and reassessed. Mrs. Harlow released her hand, nodded once to Mrs. Aldridge, ruffled Annabelle's bonnet ribbons with the comfortable familiarity of a woman who'd known this family for 30 years, and moved off through the crowd. Clara breathed. "She does that," Mrs. Aldridge said quietly beside her. "When she thinks someone needs it." Her husband was the same. Decent people, the Harlows. "She didn't have to," Clara said. "No," Mrs. Aldridge agreed. "She didn't." Nathaniel had not attended church. He rarely did, she'd gathered. The graves in the churchyard behind the building included his wife and his father, and he'd apparently decided at some point that God and he could conduct their arrangement privately, but he was in the front hall when they returned, and he looked at Clara's face and knew something had happened. "The county," he said low when the children had gone upstairs. "Some of it," Clara said. "Not all." Mrs. Harlow was... She stopped, organized herself. "It was fine." "It wasn't fine," he said not unkindly. "But I note you're still standing, so I'll adjust my question. How bad?" 3 or 4 families. The usual." She set her gloves on the hall table. "I've dealt with worse." "That is not the reassurance you think it is," Nathaniel said. Clara looked at him. He was watching her with the direct, undecorated attention she'd come to recognize as simply the way he looked at things. Not the way most men looked at women. Cataloging, assessing, deciding their value, but the way a surveyor looked at land fully and without assumption. "Crane talked," she said. "Or someone in Whitfield's network did. The story in town will be the version that makes me the problem. A woman who abandoned a lawful husband showed up in a decent man's household under false pretenses." She paused. "I want you to know that I understand what that means for your reputation, for the children's position in the county. If you've reconsidered..." "I haven't," he said. "Nathaniel." "Clara." He said her name the same way he'd said it the first time, with the quiet firmness of a decision that had already been made and wasn't up for renegotiation. "Let me be plain, because I find I don't have the patience for the longer version of this conversation. I've known 3 kinds of courage in my life. Battlefield courage, which I've seen plenty of, and which looks very dramatic and is mostly adrenaline. The courage of grief, which is quiet and relentless and mostly invisible. And the kind you have, which is the rarest of the 3, the kind that keeps showing up every morning and doing the work, regardless of whether anyone around you has the decency to acknowledge it." He stopped. "I'm not going to reconsider, and I'd appreciate it if we could put that particular conversation away and not take it back out." Clara was quiet. "All right," she said. "Good." He turned back toward his study. "Marsh is coming Wednesday morning. He'll want to speak with you. I'll be there." He nodded and went through the study door, and Clara stood in the front hall for a moment and pressed one hand flat against her sternum in the spot where the tension had loosened, and felt it had loosened slightly more. Henry Marsh arrived Wednesday at 9 o'clock. A tall man of 50, with a careful voice and the habit of writing everything down immediately, which Clara found immediately trustworthy. He shook her hand, not the fingertips, the full hand, like a man who'd been instructed or simply knew better, and settled across the library table from her and Nathaniel, and opened his case. "I've reviewed the matrimonial law as it stands," Marsh began. "The statute is not favorable. In Virginia, in 1817, a husband's legal claim to his wife's return is recognized by most courts unless specific exceptions can be demonstrated. What exceptions? Clara said. Documented evidence of physical harm. Credible witnesses. A pattern of behavior that a judge could reasonably characterize as endangerment. He paused. I've also spoken with Judge Alderman, who is sitting the next circuit, about the general, very general outline of such a case. What did he say? Nathaniel asked. He said, Marsh replied, measuring his words, that if the documentation was as thorough as described, and if the character testimony was as strong as he expected it might be, he would give the plaintiff a full hearing. He looked at Clara. You would need to testify yourself. I want to be clear about that. There is no version of this that does not require you to stand in that room and speak. Clara said, I know. It will be unpleasant. Whitfield's lawyer will challenge your credibility. They'll bring up the fact of your departure without notice. They may attempt to characterize the journal as fabricated. Let them try, Clara said. Something crossed Marsh's face, not quite a smile, but adjacent. There's one more thing, he said, and he set a different paper on the table. Whitfield himself. I had my clerk make inquiries. He paused. He's coming to Virginia. The room went still. When? Nathaniel said. Within the fortnight. He's filed a complaint with the county magistrate. That's Drummond, who, I'll be frank with you, is not a man I'd choose, but he's the man we have. Marsh looked at Clara. Whitfield intends to present himself as a wronged husband, seeking return of his wife. He'll have Crane with him, and at least one other attorney. He's planning to arrive with enough legal presence to make this look like a clear case of legal recovery rather than what it is. Clara was looking at the paper. Whitfield's name on it in Marsh's careful handwriting. Gerald Arthur Whitfield. Seeing it written down had an odd quality. It made him more real and simultaneously smaller. He was a name on paper. How was ink? He was also a man who was coming here to this county, to this property. The magistrate, Nathaniel said. Drummond. He's manageable. He's a man who respects standing, Marsh said carefully. And he's a man who does not like being made to look as though he's complicit in anything irregular. If the case is presented to him correctly, then present it to him correctly, Nathaniel said. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. He glanced at Clara, once not asking permission, she noticed, but acknowledging her, which was different. Make sure Drummond understands what he's actually being asked to be complicit in before Whitfield gets to him first. I'll ride to him this afternoon, Marsh said. He packed his case and shook hands with them both and left. Clara and Nathaniel sat in the library for a moment with the door closed and the papers on the table between them. He's coming, she said. Yes. I knew he would, eventually. He always does. She looked at her hands on the table. The last time he found me in Philadelphia, I left within 3 hours. I had my trunk already packed. I'd had it packed for 2 months. I was just waiting. Is your trunk packed now? Nathaniel asked. She met his eyes. No, she said. Not this time. The fortnight Marsh had estimated turned into 9 days. They knew, because Crane sent a letter, brazen, formally addressed to Nathaniel Carter, as head of household, phrased with the elaborate courtesy of a man who understood that elaborate courtesy was its own kind of aggression. Advising that Mr. Gerald Whitfield would be arriving in Harlan County on the 14th day of July, and would be calling upon the estate in the company of his legal representatives to discuss the matter of his wife's welfare. Nathaniel read the letter at the breakfast table without any visible change in his expression, and then passed it across to Clara. She read it. Then she set it down precisely aligned with the edge of the table and picked up her coffee. Thomas, who had developed an almost preternatural sensitivity to the atmospheric conditions of any room Clara occupied, looked up from his eggs and said, "What's in the letter?" "County business," Clara said. "You did the thing with the letter," Thomas said. "What thing?" "Where you put it down very exactly. You only do that when something makes you want to not be calm, but you're being calm anyway." Clara looked at this 8-year-old child with his father's gray eyes and his mother's perception, and thought not for the first time that raising these children must have been both extraordinary and exhausting. "Eat your eggs, Thomas," she said. He ate his eggs, but he didn't stop watching her. "Tatan," The days between Crane's letter and the 14th of July had a particular quality that Clara had experienced before, the compressed, heightened quality of a waiting period before something you know is coming and cannot prevent, where every ordinary moment carries an additional weight, because you're aware it's ordinary and don't know how many more ordinary moments you have. She taught fractions and Latin and the principles of navigation, because Annabel had decided that understanding how ships found their way across oceans was essential, and who was Clara to argue? She ate meals, she slept badly still, but slightly less badly. She attended Mrs. Harlowe's Thursday tea, which turned out to be a gathering of 4 women, all widows, all of a certain age, all possessed of the particular clarity that comes from having navigated significant loss and come out on the other side, still themselves. Mrs. Harlowe said nothing about Clara's situation directly. She served excellent tea. Tia kept the conversation moving through 3 topics without landing on anything dangerous. And when she walked Clara to the door at the end of the visit, pressed her hand and said quietly, "Whatever happens in that courtroom, you did not deserve what was done to you. I want you to know that someone who's been in this county for 60 years and seen a great deal of it is saying that plainly." Clara couldn't speak for a moment. "Thank you," she managed. Mrs. Harlowe patted her hand. "Don't thank me. Just make sure that man understands that this county is not the Philadelphia Social Register, and that some of us know exactly how to make a man's reputation turn to smoke." Nathaniel in those 9 days became a different version of himself in ways that Clara tracked carefully, because tracking felt safer than simply experiencing them. He started working in the evenings in the back sitting room rather than the study, which meant that on the nights when Clara came down, because sleep was being difficult, she didn't find an empty kitchen, but a man at a table with papers and a lamp who looked up when she came in and said, "Couldn't sleep," without alarm or judgment, and poured her a cup of whatever was still warm and went back to his papers. They talked sometimes, not about Whitfield, not about the approaching 14th, but about other things, the children, the estate. A book Clara had found in the library that turned out to be one Nathaniel had read twice and had opinions about. He had unexpectedly strong opinions about books delivered in the same dry, precise voice he used for crop reports, which Clara found she enjoyed more than she'd anticipated. She told him once on a night when the conversation had moved into easier territory that she'd wanted to be a teacher since she was 12. That she'd had a governess herself briefly before her father's money ran out, a woman named Miss Arden, who'd taught her Greek and mathematics and how to argue a position without losing her temper. "She sounds formidable," Nathaniel said. She was. She also told me that a woman with a good education was a woman with options, which in 1802 was a fairly radical statement. "Did you believe her?" Clara considered. "I believed her enough to educate myself past the point anyone expected. Whether it gave me options." She stopped. "It gave me the ability to earn my own living. After. That's not nothing." "It's not nothing," he agreed. Then after a moment, "What happened to your father?" "Business debts, then his health. He died when I was 19. She kept her voice level and informational. "My mother had died the previous year. I had no siblings, no family money, no prospects in the way that word was generally meant. Gerald Whitfield was." She paused. "He was established, respected in Philadelphia. He presented himself as a serious man with serious intentions. He was very charming when he wanted to be. I want you to understand that, because people always assume, they assume that women who end up in that situation should have known, should have seen it. Sometimes the answer is that you didn't see it because it wasn't there to see yet." Nathaniel was looking at the table. "I know," he said. Something in the way he said it, not sympathetic, not the wide expressive sympathy of someone hearing something painful, but the flat acknowledgement of someone who also knows how people become unrecognizable over time, made her look at him more directly. "Eleanor," she said, carefully. He was quiet for a moment. "She was ill for 2 years before she died," he said. "The last 6 months, she was not the woman I married. The pain changed her. The laudanum they gave her changed her more." He looked up. "I don't say that to diminish her. I say it because I understand that people become people you don't recognize. And it doesn't mean you failed to see them clearly. It means things changed." Clara looked at this man across the table, sealed and precise, and occasionally in the lamplight after 9 o'clock. When the house was quiet, something else entirely, and felt the specific dangerous tenderness of recognizing someone. Yes, she said. That's exactly it. They sat in the comfortable quiet of the kitchen for another half hour, and neither of them reached for anything more than what it was. But when Clara went upstairs, she lay down and slept without counting for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. On the 13th of July, the day before Whitfield was due to arrive, Marsh came back. He looked different from the last visit. The careful attorney's calm was in place, but underneath it something had shifted. "Drummond has agreed to a formal hearing," he said when they were all three in the study with the door closed. "That's the good news. He's agreed to review documentation and hear testimony from both parties before issuing any order." "And the rest," Nathaniel said. Marsh set his briefcase on the desk and opened it slowly. "Whitfield's attorneys have filed a counter-motion. They're claiming that the journal is fraudulent. They have a statement." He pulled out the paper from a doctor in Philadelphia who treated you in 1814. He claims the injuries he documented were the result of a fall from a horse. Clara looked at the paper. The doctor's name was Morrison. She remembered him precisely. She remembered sitting in his examination room while Gerald stood in the corner with his hands in his pockets, and Morrison had written down equestrian accident with the comfortable efficiency of a man who had decided which version of events was less complicated. "He's lying," Clara said. "I know," Marsh said. "I was never on a horse in 1814. I hadn't ridden in 2 years. He knows I hadn't ridden. Gerald told him what to write, and he wrote it." "Can you prove that?" Clara thought. She opened the satchel, different now, lighter, the journal gone to the safe but still with her out of habit and thought. "The feed merchant on Callaway Street," she said. "He sold hay to Gerald's stable. He would have records. If no horses were purchased or maintained during that period, if the stable was empty, Morrison's account falls apart." She looked at Marsh. "I remember because Gerald sold the horses in the spring of 1813. He didn't buy new ones until 1815. There were no horses in that stable in 1814. There couldn't have been an equestrian accident." Marsh stared at her. "You remember the feed merchant," he said. "I remember everything," Clara said flatly. "I had 4 years to decide whether I was ever going to use any of it. I decided yes." Marsh looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was looking at Clara. "Write it down," Marsh said, pulling out paper. "Everything. Names, addresses, dates, anything you remember. We have tonight." Clara picked up the pen. "Then let's not waste it," she said. She wrote for 3 hours. Marsh took notes and asked questions and occasionally said quietly, "That's good. That's very good," with the measured certainty of a man who was beginning to understand the shape of what he was dealing with. Nathaniel sat at the far end of the table and said nothing, but he didn't leave. By midnight, they had 14 specific documented incidents with names and dates and potential witnesses. They had the stable record angle, which Marsh was confident could be corroborated within the week through a contact in Philadelphia. They had 3 neighbors from the Whitfield household street who had seen things, who had crucially never been asked on record what they'd seen because no one had ever formally asked. They had the journal, which Marsh had now read fully, and which had gone quiet in him in a specific way, the way a careful man goes quiet when confronted with something that matters. "He thinks this is a simple recovery case," Marsh said, gathering his papers. "He thinks you're the same woman who ran. He doesn't know what you've been building." "No," Clara said. "He doesn't. One more thing." Marsh looked at her. "Drummond will want character testimony. Witnesses who can speak to who you are now, your conduct, your standing. I need names." "Mrs. Harlow," Nathaniel said before Clara could speak. Marsh nodded. "Anyone else?" Clara thought of Mrs. Aldridge, who had known about the bruises since the second day and chosen to trust her anyway. She thought of Thomas, who was 8 years old and couldn't testify, but who had decided to stand on her left at church with squared shoulders. She thought of Annabelle, who had told her father that Miss Clara knew how to make the scary things smaller. "I have names," she said. Marsh gathered his case and left. The house was entirely quiet. Clara sat at the study table with the papers, and Nathaniel sat across from her, and after a moment he said, "Tomorrow's going to be hard." "Yes," she said. "Are you ready?" She looked at him across the table. This man who had come to stand at the top of his own front steps, who had poured her tea in the kitchen at 3 in the morning without being asked, who had said, "I've known 3 kinds of courage," and meant it without ornamentation. "I've been ready for 4 years," she said. "I just didn't have anywhere to stand." The lamp burned low between them. Tomorrow Gerald Whitfield was coming to Harlan County, and Clara Bennett was not leaving. Gerald Whitfield arrived at 11 o'clock in the morning, and he arrived the way he did everything with the careful theater of a man who understood that appearance was its own argument. There were 3 carriages. The first carried Whitfield himself and Crane. The second carried 2 additional attorneys whose names Clara did not yet know, but whose coats told her everything she needed to know about how much money was being spent on this. The third carried enough luggage for a week, which told her that Whitfield had not come expecting a quick resolution. He had come expecting to settle in and apply pressure until the pressure worked. Clara watched from the upstairs window. She'd told herself she wouldn't, and then she'd done it anyway because she needed to see him before he saw her. She needed the advantage of first sight. Gerald Whitfield was 41 years old, lean, sandy-haired, with the kind of face that photographed well and charmed immediately. Open, pleasant, the face of a man. Other men found reasonable, and women initially found appealing. He stepped down from the carriage and looked up at the Carter house with the assessing gaze of a man calculating its value, and in that single unguarded moment before he'd composed himself into the role of wronged and worried husband, Clara saw the thing underneath his face that she'd spent 3 years of marriage learning to read, and 1 year of running learning to never have to read again. He was angry. Not the hot, explosive anger that advertised itself. The cold, controlled anger of a man who considered himself owed something and had come to collect it. She turned from the window, smoothed her dress with both hands, walked downstairs. Nathaniel met Whitfield at the front door himself. Clara had asked to be present for the first meeting she'd been specific about, that she was not going to be positioned as something that was happening in the background of her own situation, and she stood at Nathaniel's right when the door opened. The moment Whitfield's eyes found her, she watched him recalibrate. He'd expected she knew a version of the woman who'd left Philadelphia with a packed trunk and no forwarding address. He'd expected the woman who'd apologized reflexively, who'd learned to make herself small, who startled at raised voices, and had developed the habitual posture of someone braced for impact. He'd been building his entire legal and social strategy around that woman. He was looking at a different one. "Margaret," he said. His voice was warm, concerned, practiced. "Thank God. I've been so worried." "My name is Clara," she said. "Clara Bennett. You know that." A flicker. Controlled immediately. "Darling, you're confused. Mr. Whitfield." Nathaniel's voice was not loud and did not need to be. "You're on my property. You'll address Miss Bennett by the name she prefers, or you won't address her at all. Those are the terms." Whitfield turned his attention to Nathaniel with the deliberate reorientation of a man shifting tactical targets. He smiled. The smile was excellent. It really was. Clara had to grant him that. He'd always known exactly how to construct warmth from the outside in. "Mr. Carter," Whitfield said, "I appreciate your concern for my wife's welfare. She's clearly been through a difficult time, and I'm grateful she found a safe harbor here. I've come to bring her home." "She is home," Nathaniel said. "But you're welcome to make your case to the magistrate. Drummond's hearing is set for Thursday. Until then, you and your people are welcome to whatever accommodations you've arranged in town." Whitfield's smile held. His eyes did not match it. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," Nathaniel confirmed. "Good day, Mr. Whitfield." Crane tried. That was the thing about Crane, he was dogged. Before Nathaniel could close the door, Crane had stepped forward with the smooth persistence of a man paid by the hour. "Mr. Carter, I must advise you that harboring a woman in defiance of her husband's legal claim could constitute—" "Marsh," Nathaniel said. Henry Marsh stepped out of the study doorway to the left of the hall, papers in hand, and looked at Crane with the pleasant, empty expression of a man who has been a lawyer for 25 years and has long since stopped finding the other side surprising. Mr. Crane, Marsh said. Henry Marsh representing Miss Bennett's interests before the Harlan County Circuit. I believe we've corresponded. The hearing is Thursday at 9 o'clock. I'll see you then. Crane looked at Marsh, looked at Nathaniel, looked past them both at Clara, who was standing in the hallway with her hands at her sides and her face perfectly composed. He left. The door closed. Clara breathed. That went approximately as expected, Marsh said, tucking his papers under his arm. He looked at the house, Clara said. When he got out of the carriage, he was valuing it. Yes, Nathaniel said. He's not just coming for me, she said. Or not only for me. There's something else. Marsh and Nathaniel exchanged a look, the kind of look that told her they'd already had this conversation without her. What? She said. Marsh set his papers on the hall table. My Philadelphia contact came through this morning. The feed merchant records. He paused. He also found something else. Whitfield has significant debts. Has had them for 2 years. He's been managing creditors carefully, but the picture is not good. A wife who left takes certain assets with her legally, including her dowry, if it was never formalized into the marital estate, which in your case, it wasn't, Clara said. Her voice had gone flat. He kept asking me to sign documents formalizing it. I kept not signing. He said it was fine. He said we'd handle it properly when the time was right. She understood suddenly with the cold clarity of a woman who had just assembled a picture she'd been looking at sideways for 4 years. He needs the money. He needs the money, Marsh confirmed. Which means this is not purely personal. It was never purely personal, Clara said. He doesn't do anything that isn't also strategic. She looked at Marsh directly. Does that help us or hurt us? Potentially helps us, Marsh said. A judge who might be sympathetic to a husband's emotional claim to his wife is considerably less sympathetic to a husband whose financial motivations are documented. It changes the character of the case. Then document them, Clara said. The 2 days between Whitfield's arrival and Thursday's hearing were not quiet ones. On Tuesday afternoon, Clara was in the garden with the children when Mrs. Aldridge came out with the specific walking pace of a woman delivering news she'd rather not deliver. 2 women from the Tuesday market came to the back door, Mrs. Aldridge said. Wanted to know if it was true that Mr. Carter was hiding a criminal runaway. What did you tell them? Clara asked. I told them that Mr. Carter employed a highly qualified governess who had the full support of the household, and that the children looked better than they had in a year, and that if they had specific questions about the legal matters, they could take them to Henry Marsh, and then I gave them each a jar of preserve and sent them on their way. She paused. Also, Mrs. Patterson came by in the afternoon. Alone. She wants to speak with you. Clara looked up. Mrs. Patterson. I know she wasn't kind at church. I told her you were busy. But she's been standing in the road twice today, and she looked like a woman who has something to say and has been sitting on it too long. Clara thought about this. Send her to the sitting room, she said. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Mrs. Patterson was a small, anxious woman of about 50, with good intentions that had been consistently overridden in Clara's experience by the social instinct to go where the current was going. She was sitting on the edge of the settee when Clara came in, and she stood immediately and said, Miss Bennett, I owe you an apology. Sit down, Mrs. Patterson. They both sat. Mrs. Patterson folded her hands in her lap. At church. I should not have. You were doing what people do when the story they've been told makes someone seem complicated, Clara said. I understand it. It wasn't right. Mrs. Patterson looked at her hands. My first husband before George when I was very young. She stopped. I'm not comparing. I don't mean to. I know what it looks like from the outside, and I know it doesn't look like what it is. And when I saw your face at church, I recognized something, and then I walked away from it, and I've felt wrong about it since. Clara was very still. Did anyone help you? Clara asked quietly. Mrs. Patterson looked up. My mother, she said. She came and she took me home, and she didn't ask me a single question about why. She just took me home. Her voice had gone rough at the edges. I thought about that on Sunday. When I walked away from you, I thought my mother didn't walk away." The sitting room was very quiet. "Would you be willing," Clara said carefully, "to speak to a lawyer, Marsh? He represents me in the hearing Thursday. He's looking for character witnesses. But he's also—" She paused. "There may be other women. Women Whitfield knew in Philadelphia. If there's a pattern, if it can be established that I'm not, that this isn't an isolated—" "Yes," Mrs. Patterson said, before Clara had finished the sentence. "Yes, whatever you need." Wednesday arrived with the quality of a held breath. Marsh came in the morning with the Philadelphia information. The feed merchant records confirmed the stable documented as empty from spring 1813 through summer 1815. Morrison's account of an equestrian accident in 1814 rendered materially impossible. He also brought something else, a letter from a woman in Philadelphia named Dorothea Haynes, the wife of one of Whitfield's business associates, who had, upon being contacted by Marsh's Philadelphia colleague, stated in writing that she had observed bruising on Margaret Whitfield's wrists at a dinner in 1813, and that Gerald Whitfield had explained it as a consequence of his wife's clumsiness. That was the word he'd used, clumsiness. Dorothea Haynes had written it down in her own careful hand and signed her name to it, and Marsh set it on the desk in front of Clara, and Clara looked at it for a long moment. "She remembered," Clara said. "People tend to remember," Marsh said quietly. "They just don't always get asked." Clara nodded, pressed her hands flat on the table, steadied. "What else?" she asked. "Whitfield's attorneys filed a motion this morning to have the hearing closed to the public." Marsh's voice was neutral, but his eyes were not. Drummond denied it. The significance of that landed in the room. "He denied it," Nathaniel said. "He denied it," Marsh confirmed. "The hearing will be open. Anyone in the county who wants to attend may attend." Nathaniel looked at Clara. Clara looked at the letter from Dorothea Haynes. An open hearing meant the county would see. It meant that everything Whitfield presented, every version of her he tried to construct in that room, would be built in front of witnesses. It cut both ways. She would also have to testify in public, in front of everyone, but it cut both ways, and she'd take the trade. "Good," she said. That evening, Whitfield came back to the estate. Not with carriages and attorneys this time. Alone. He rode up to the front gate on a bay horse and asked to speak with Clara privately and the gatekeeper, a man named Amos, who had worked for the Carter family for 15 years, and who had clearly received instructions told him that Miss Bennett was not available, and that if he had business to conduct, he was welcome to conduct it Thursday at the hearing. Clara was in the upstairs hallway when she heard the horse. She went to the window. Whitfield sat at the gate for a full minute after Amos delivered the message. He sat very still, the way he always went still when something hadn't gone the way he'd intended. And she watched him from the upstairs window, with her arms crossed over her chest and her breathing deliberate and measured. Then he looked up. He looked up at exactly the right window, as though he'd known she'd be there, and for a moment they were looking directly at each other across the distance between the gate and the upper floor of the Carter house. He smiled at her. Not the public smile. Not the charming, constructed warmth he deployed for audiences. The private one, the one she'd learned to read in 3 years of marriage, as the smile that preceded specific kinds of cruelty. The one that said, "I know you. I know where all of it lives. And I am patient." Clara did not look away. She kept her eyes on his, and she did not move, and she did not flinch. And after a moment, it was Whitfield who turned his horse and rode back toward town. She uncrossed her arms. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them together until they stopped. He thought the smile would still work on her. He thought he still had that. He was wrong. Thursday morning arrived gray and close, the kind of July morning that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be brutally hot or break open into rain. Clara dressed carefully. Not in her best dress. Her best dress was a pale blue that Mrs. Aldridge had suggested, and Clara had considered it, and chosen instead the dark gray wool conservative, and unadorned the dress of a working woman with nothing to prove through fashion. She put her hair up plainly. She wore no jewelry. She looked exactly like what she was, and that was entirely the point. Nathaniel knocked on her door at 8 o'clock. "Ready," he asked when she opened it. She looked at him for a moment. He was in his good coat, not his best, she noted, which was interesting, and his expression was the controlled level expression she'd come to understand meant he'd already decided how the day was going to go, and was simply waiting for it to catch up. "Yes," she said. "Marsh is downstairs. Mrs. Aldridge is staying with the children." He paused. "Mrs. Harlow sent a note this morning. She'll be at the hearing. She says to tell you she's bringing 4 friends and they will be seated prominently." Something that was almost a laugh moved through Clara. "Of course she is. She also says," he looked at the note briefly, "that you should stand up straight and speak clearly because the back row has trouble hearing." This time she did laugh briefly, a real one, and the sound of it surprised her slightly. Nathaniel looked at her when she laughed. The controlled expression shifted just slightly in the way she'd begun to learn the way the surface of him moved when something underneath it was responding to something real. "Let's go," she said. The Harlan County Magistrates' Hall was a single large room that smelled of wood and old paper and the specific mustiness of a building used for serious purposes. By the time they arrived at 20 minutes to 9, it was already more than half full. Clara had not expected the room. She'd pictured something smaller, more contained, a formal proceeding with a limited audience, manageable and clinical. This was neither of those things. This was the county come to witness something, which meant it was already a performance before anyone had spoken a word, and the only question was, who would control the performance? Whitfield was already there, seated at the plaintiff's table with Crane and the 2 Richmond attorneys arranged around him like a law firm's worth of expensive certainty. He'd dressed for the occasion, dark blue coat, white cravat, the complete and studied picture of a respectable husband, patiently pursuing his legal rights. He didn't look at Clara when she entered. That was calculated too, she knew it. Marsh guided her to the respondent's table, which felt immediately wrong to her respondent, as if she were the one answering for something. But she sat down without comment and arranged the papers Marsh had given her and looked at the room. Mrs. Harlow was in the 3rd row as promised, flanked by 4 women of equivalent age and presence. Mrs. Patterson was behind them with 2 women Clara didn't recognize, who had the particular careful attention of people who have come to watch something specific. On the far side of the room, she spotted 2 men she'd seen at the feed store, and one she recognized as the husband of a woman from the Tuesday market. The county, in other words, had come with all of its complexity and all of its contradictions, and it was going to watch what happened to a woman who'd refused to go quietly. Drummond entered at exactly 9. He was a man of 60, compact and gray, with the professional impassivity of a magistrate, who'd seen most of what people were capable of and had organized himself accordingly. He settled behind his bench and looked out at the room, and then he looked at Whitfield's table, and then at Clara's, and something in his face did a small, careful assessment. He opened the session. Whitfield's lead attorney, a man named Parrish from Richmond, with a voice designed to fill large rooms comfortably, presented the case with the smooth, confident velocity of someone who believed he was working with a losing opposition. The story he told was simple, sympathetic, and almost entirely fictitious. A devoted husband, a wife of fragile temperament, an inexplicable flight, a year of searching, driven by genuine concern, a legal proceeding undertaken as a last resort after all other avenues had been exhausted. How was good at it? Clara gave him that. He had the tone exactly right, sorrowful rather than accusatory, patient rather than angry, and she could see from the room's stillness that some of it was landing. Then he said the word, unstable. He said it carefully embedded in a longer sentence about Clara's history of instability and flight, and Clara felt Nathaniel sitting directly behind her go very still. She put her hand back slightly flat on the table, without turning a gesture that said, "I have this." She felt more than saw him register it and hold. Parrish finished. Drummond looked at Marsh. Marsh stood. Henry Marsh did not have Parrish's room-filling voice. He had something better. He had the precise, unpretentious steadiness of a man who knows he is right and is not in a hurry to perform that knowledge, who simply intends to lay it down fact by fact until the weight of it is undeniable. He started with the medical records. Morrison's report, the equestrian accident, 1814. Then the feed merchant's records. Then the timeline. The stable that had been empty since spring 1813. The horse that couldn't have been ridden because there was no horse. He did it without drama. He did it the way you dismantle something piece by piece without announcing what you're doing, so that by the time it becomes clear, it's already done. Crane at the plaintiff's table started writing notes with increased urgency. Whitfield's expression did not change, but his right hand resting on the table closed slowly into a fist. Clara watched the fist. She'd learned to watch that hand. Then Marsh called his first witness, and the room shifted. Dorothea Haynes was not present. She'd sent her written statement from Philadelphia, but Marsh read it into the record in its entirety, slowly, including the word clumsiness. He let that word sit in the air of the room for a moment before moving on. Then he called Mrs. Patterson. She came to the front with the particular courage of a woman who had made up her mind and was not going to let nerves talk her out of it. She sat straight. She spoke clearly. She described without embellishment what she'd seen at church, not the events before the hearing, but a specific separate incident she'd witnessed 2 years earlier in Philadelphia, when she'd been visiting her sister and had seen Clara at a market, had seen the careful way Clara moved, the specific vigilance of her posture, had seen Whitfield appear at her elbow, and watched Clara's face do something that Mrs. Patterson recognized because she had once known it from the inside. Parrish cross-examined her with polished efficiency, trying to characterize the observation as projection, as assumption. Mrs. Patterson looked him in the eye. "I'm not a woman given to assumptions, Mr. Parrish," she said. "I'm a woman who has lived inside a marriage that looked fine from the outside, and I know what I saw." Drummond did not interrupt. The room was very quiet. Marsh called Clara last. She walked to the front, sat in the witness chair, and looked out at the room. All of it. The county with all its contradictions. Whitfield at his table with his fist and his expensive attorneys. Mrs. Harlow in the third-row spine. Straight eyes on Clara, with the steady encouragement of a woman who had been 65 years in this county and intended Clara to know she was not alone in it. Marsh asked her to describe the marriage. She did. She did it the way she'd trained herself to do it, the way she'd prepared across 4 years of carrying the journal and 14 specific documented incidents, and the cold, considered decision that if the right judge in the right county ever asked, she would answer with everything she had, and she would not flinch, and she would not apologize, and she would not make herself small to make the room more comfortable. She talked for 20 minutes. She was specific. She used dates and places and the words for things rather than the softened, euphemistic language she'd heard other women use, the language designed to make the described events less shocking. She did not use that language. She used the precise language because precision was what had always made Gerald Whitfield most uncomfortable, and she was done accommodating that. Halfway through, she heard someone in the back row make a sound. Not words, just a sound. Quiet and involuntary. The sound of a person hearing something they recognized. She did not look up. When she finished, Parrish stood for cross-examination. He tried 3 angles. He tried the instability characterization again, and Marsh objected before he'd finished the sentence, and Drummond sustained it. He tried to suggest that the documented incidents were exaggerated, and Clara looked at him with the flat, direct steadiness of someone who had spent 4 years deciding to be exact, and said, "I described them accurately. If you'd like to dispute a specific date or incident, please do so, and I will address it." He did not dispute a specific date or incident. He tried finally to make the flight from the marriage the issue, the abandonment, the deception of name. And Clara said, "I left because I was afraid for my life. I changed my name because he had found me twice before. I took work under that name because it was the only way I could earn a living without being located. None of those facts are in dispute, and none of them are the question you should be asking." Parrish sat down. Drummond looked at Clara for a moment. "You may step down, Miss Bennett," he said. "Not Mrs. Whitfield. Miss Bennett." Clara heard it and kept her face composed and walked back to her seat. It was Whitfield himself who broke it open. He had not been scheduled to testify. His attorneys had built their case to not require it, understanding clearly that their client was safer as a sympathetic absence than as a present-speaking person. But when Marsh finished, and Drummond asked if the plaintiff's table had anything further, Whitfield stood. Crane grabbed his arm. Whitfield shook him off. "I'd like to address the court," Whitfield said. Parrish went very still with the stillness of a man who has just watched his strategy walk off a cliff. Drummond looked at Whitfield. "You may speak." Whitfield turned to the room. He turned to the room, not to the magistrate, because Whitfield had always understood that the real court was the room, the audience, the community, the social weight of collective opinion. He addressed them with the confident ease of a man who had spent his whole life being found persuasive. "I am a man who has made mistakes," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise. Our marriage had difficulties. All marriages do. But what has been said here?" He shook his head with a grief so well constructed it was genuinely impressive. "Is a profound mischaracterization of events that were, yes, sometimes painful, but never." "Mr. Whitfield," Drummond said. Whitfield continued, "never constituted what she has suggested, and I believe that with proper care and time, Margaret Clara." "Mr. Whitfield." Drummond's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "Sit down." Whitfield stopped. He looked at Drummond. He did the calculation. And something in what he saw in Drummond's face told him the calculation had come back wrong. He sat. The room exhaled. Drummond looked at his papers for a long moment. The room was so quiet that Clara could hear the creak of the bench behind her, which she identified as Nathaniel, and she kept her eyes forward and her breathing even, and waited. "The medical documentation presented by Mr. Marsh," Drummond said slowly, "in combination with the witness testimony and the documentary evidence regarding the stable records presents a substantive challenge to the plaintiff's account." He paused. "The court is also—" Another pause, the weight of a man choosing his words with the care they deserved, persuaded by the character and specificity of the respondent's testimony. Whitfield's attorney started to rise. "Your Honor." "I'm not finished," Drummond said, and the attorney sat. "The plaintiff's motion for legal recovery of his wife is denied. The respondent will remain where she is in the county, under her preferred name, with the full protection of this court. A restraining order will be issued prohibiting Mr. Whitfield from approaching within a half-mile of the Carter estate, or Miss Bennett's person." He looked over his glasses at Whitfield. "Mr. Whitfield, I would strongly advise you to take your legal team and return to Philadelphia. If you are found in violation of this order, you will find that Harlan County is a less hospitable place than you've been led to believe." He closed the file. "This hearing is adjourned." The room broke open. Not loudly. This was a county court, not a tavern, but the controlled eruption of a room full of people releasing held breath simultaneously. Clara sat at her table for a moment and pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed. Marsh was beside her immediately. "It's done," he said quietly. "That's a full protective order. He can't touch you." "He can appeal," she said. "He can. He won't. The financial exposure we've established motive clearly enough that any appeal looks like a man pursuing money rather than a marriage. Parrish will advise against it." Marsh paused. "It's done, Miss Bennett." She looked at the table, at her hands on it, at the grain of the wood, the particular solidity of something real under her palms. Then she looked up and she looked across the room and she found Whitfield, who was standing at his table while his attorneys packed their cases. He was looking at her. The private smile was gone. In its place was the expression underneath it, the one she'd spent 3 years learning to brace for, and it was just an expression on a man's face in a public room, in a county where everyone could see it, and it had no power anymore, because there was nowhere for it to go. He looked away first, behind her. A hand came down on her shoulder briefly once, and she didn't need to look to know it was Nathaniel, because she'd cataloged the weight of that hand by now, and she knew it from the weight of a decision rather than a reflex. She heard Mrs. Harlow's voice across the room, cutting through the noise with the precision of a woman who'd spent 65 years making herself heard when it mattered. "Well, that's settled then." And somewhere behind the magistrate's bench, in the general direction of where Whitfield's attorneys were gathering their expensive cases and their bruised arguments. Crane said something Clara couldn't hear, and Parrish responded, and whatever it was, neither of them looked up. Clara sat in the chair in the Harlan County Magistrates Hall and let the room settle around her, and she felt for the first time in 4 years the specific, unfamiliar sensation of something finally being finished. Not healed. Not resolved in the way that meant the marks were gone, and the wiring was fixed, and the midnight countings were done with. But finished. The running was finished. She was still in the chair where she'd decided to stand, and Gerald Whitfield was packing to leave, and outside the windows of that gray July morning, the sky was finally deciding to break open and rain. The rain came down hard for 3 hours after the hearing, the kind of summer rain that meant business, that washed the red clay from the road in long red rivers and turned the Carter estate's front drive into a study in mud and consequence. Nobody went outside. Nobody particularly wanted to. Clara sat in the back sitting room with a cup of tea she hadn't touched and listened to the rain on the windows and tried to locate herself in the specific way she'd been doing for 4 years, counting the details, anchoring in the room, confirming that she was where she was and not somewhere else. The ceiling. The smell of beeswax. The sound of Annabelle upstairs singing something formless and cheerful to her collection of carved wooden animals. The difference was that this time when she finished counting, she didn't immediately begin bracing for the next thing. There wasn't a next thing. Not the same kind of next thing. She didn't know what to do with that. Mrs. Aldridge came in at some point with a plate of food and set it beside the untouched tea without comment, because Mrs. Aldridge had the particular wisdom to understand that some silences needed company more than they needed conversation. She sat across from Clara with her own cup and her mending and simply stayed there, which was exactly right. After a while, Clara said, "I don't know what comes next." "No," Mrs. Aldridge said, biting a thread. "I don't suppose you do. I've been planning for the hearing for 9 days. Before that, I was planning for his arrival. Before that, I was planning to stay." She looked at the untouched tea. "I've been planning for so long that I don't quite know what it feels like to not be planning for something." "It feels like this," Mrs. Aldridge said, gesturing mildly at the room. "At first. And then," Mrs. Aldridge set her mending in her lap and looked at Clara directly. "And then you find out who you are when you're not running. Some women find out they're smaller than they thought. Most find out they're considerably larger." She picked up the mending again. "I know which one you are." Clara looked at her. "You can't know that yet." "I've known it since the 2nd week," Mrs. Aldridge said placidly, "when Thomas conjugated 4 verbs. Nathaniel came in at 3:30 after the rain had eased to a steady drizzle. He came in without ceremony, sat down across from Clara in the chair Mrs. Aldridge had vacated, and looked at her with the direct, undecorated attention that she'd stopped finding unnerving around the 2nd week of July. "Marsh sent word," he said. "Whitfield and his party left the county at noon. Parrish has already advised against appeal exactly as Marsh predicted. The order is registered with the circuit court, and 3 copies are filed." Clara nodded. "It's done," Nathaniel said. "People keep telling me that," she said. "Because it is." "I know." She looked at her hands. "I believe it. I'm just not sure my body has received the information yet." I was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man who didn't know what to say, but the silence of a man who understood that some things didn't require immediate response. "It'll take time," he said. "What's been wound up that tight for 4 years doesn't unwind in an afternoon." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." She looked up at him. "You were there for the whole thing. You didn't have to be. You could have sent Marsh and waited here." "I could have," he said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you went in there alone for 3 years, and nobody stood in the same direction you were standing. I told you I would. I meant it." Clara pressed her lips together, breathed. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it. The lawyers and the hearing and—" She stopped. "For not treating me like something that needed to be managed." "You made that fairly impossible," he said, and there was something in his voice, dry and warm, that was the closest she'd heard him come to lightness. "You're not a particularly manageable person. I take that as a compliment." "It is one," he said. Annabelle found Clara in the hallway 20 minutes later, having apparently decided that the rain was adequate justification for locating every person in the household and confirming their physical presence. She wrapped both arms around Clara's waist without preamble, which was Annabelle's standard greeting when she felt the need for one, and pressed her face against Clara's side. Mrs. Aldridge said the bad man went away. She said the words somewhat muffled. "Yes," Clara said, putting her hand on the back of the small head. "He did." "Is he going to come back?" "No, sweetheart, he can't." Annabelle considered this for a moment. "Good," she said with the flat satisfaction of a 6-year-old who has reached a conclusion and sees no reason to complicate it further. "Because I told Thomas that if he came back, I was going to throw my arithmetic slate at him." "You were not going to throw your slate. I was thinking about it very hard," Annabelle said, which was probably accurate. Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked down at Clara with his father's gray eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then he came down the stairs, stopped on the second-to-last step so that he was at eye level with her, and said with the careful formality of a boy who had decided to do something and was going to do it correctly, "I'm glad you didn't leave." Clara looked at this 8-year-old who had spent a year running off tutors and who had stood on her left at church with squared shoulders and who had noticed when she put letters down too precisely. "So am I, Thomas," she said. He nodded once with the gravity of a matter settled and went back upstairs to whatever he'd been doing. Annabelle stayed wrapped around Clara's waist for another minute before releasing her and following her brother. Clara stood in the hallway alone and felt something in her chest move, not break. Nothing so dramatic as that, but shift. Quietly, significantly, the way a house settles into new ground after a season of difficult weather. The first letter came 3 days after the hearing. It arrived with the Morning Post addressed to Miss Clara Bennett, in handwriting she didn't recognize, postmarked from a town in Maryland. She opened it at the breakfast table, which was where the post was always delivered, and read it twice, and then set it down beside her coffee, with the precise, deliberate care of a woman managing a significant reaction. Nathaniel across the table looked up from his own correspondence. "What is it?" he said. "A woman named Lillian Cross," Clara said. She read about the hearing, and apparently Marsh's proceedings were noted in the Richmond Enquirer. A brief notice. She read it and... She stopped, organized herself. "She was married to a business associate of Whitfield's. She says she needs to speak with a lawyer. She says she's been trying to leave for 2 years and she doesn't know how." Nathaniel set down his own letter. "She wrote to you," he said. "She wrote to me." Clara looked at the letter again. "She said she read what I said in testimony. She said," her voice went careful and level, "she said she hadn't known anyone had used that language before. The exact words, without the soft versions." The kitchen was very quiet. "How did she know to write to you here?" Nathaniel asked. The notice in the Enquirer mentioned the Carter estate. She set the letter down. "Nathaniel, she needs Marsh." "Then write to Marsh this morning." "I will." She looked at him. "There may be more." "There may be," he said. He looked at her steadily. "Would that be all right?" Clara thought about Dorothea Haynes, who had written down the word clumsiness and signed her name to it. She thought about Mrs. Patterson, who had sat in the witness chair and said, "I know what I saw." She thought about Lillian Cross in Maryland, who had read a notice in a newspaper and found the language she hadn't known existed, and had written a letter to a woman she'd never met. "Yes," she said, "it would be more than all right." The second letter came the following Tuesday, this one from Philadelphia. The third arrived Thursday from a woman in Richmond who said she'd been at the hearing, had been in the back row, had made the sound. Clara hadn't been able to identify, had driven 3 hours to sit in that room, because she'd heard from a cousin that something was happening in Harlan County that she needed to see. By the end of July, there were 7 letters. Marsh drove out on a Wednesday afternoon with the expression of a man who has had his professional assumptions significantly revised. "I want to speak with each of them," he said, sitting in the study with Clara and Nathaniel. "With their permission, if what you've described in this correspondence is consistent." He paused, the careful attorney's pause that meant he was thinking something he hadn't yet decided to say aloud. Whitfield's situation in Philadelphia may become considerably more complicated. What do you mean? Clara said. I mean that 7 women constitutes a pattern. He looked at her. And a pattern documented and witnessed and legally established is a different order of problem than a single case. He paused again. This could go considerably further than your individual protection order. Clara looked at the letters on the desk. 7 envelopes. 7 different hands. 7 different women who had sat down and picked up a pen and decided to do the thing they'd been afraid to do because they'd read about a woman in Harlan County who'd stood up in a courtroom and used the exact words. Good, she said. Let it. It was in the first week of August that something shifted between Clara and Nathaniel in a way that was less about a specific moment than about the accumulated weight of 100 small ones. It happened the way real things tend to happen, not in a single dramatic instant, but in the slow accumulation of ordinary time. The evening conversations in the back sitting room had become without announcement a consistent thing. After the children were in bed after Mrs. Aldridge had retired, Clara would come downstairs with a book she may or may not actually read, and Nathaniel would be at the table with his accounts or his correspondence, or occasionally nothing at all, and they would sit in the same space with the comfortable ease of 2 people who had stopped performing for each other. He told her one evening in early August about the war. Not the broad strokes, she knew the broad strokes, everyone knew the broad strokes, but the specific smaller things. The cold in the mornings before an engagement. The way time moved differently in that context. A particular lieutenant he'd been responsible for 18 years old, who had written letters home to his mother every single week, and had died on a Tuesday in September, and whose letters Nathaniel had gathered and sent to the mother in Maryland, with a note he'd rewritten 4 times before he could make himself satisfied with it. Did she write back? Clara asked. Once, he said. She thanked me. She said reading the letters was the hardest thing she'd ever done, and also that she wouldn't have been without them. He was quiet for a moment. I've thought about that distinction a lot. Hard and valuable being the same thing rather than opposites. Clara looked at him. Is that how you think about Eleanor? I was quiet for longer this time. Not the silence of a man avoiding the question, but the silence of a man giving it its appropriate weight. Eleanor she was a good woman, he said. Genuinely good. Funny when she was well. She had a way of finding the precise right thing to say that made you feel like the smartest person you'd ever met, just for being in the same room. He looked at the table. The illness took a long time. The last months were very hard. And afterward I was angry for quite a while. Not at her. At the fact of it. At the specific cruelty of watching someone become unrecognizable. Yes, Clara said. Thomas was 7. Annabelle was 5. He stopped. I was not well equipped for it. I am not naturally a man who is good at the softer requirements. You're better at them than you believe, Clara said. He looked at her. You poured me tea at 3 in the morning, she said. Without being asked. You stood at the top of your front steps. You told a man with an expensive coat to get off your land because I'd asked you not to leave. She paused. A man who is not good at the softer requirements doesn't do those things. Something moved in his face. The surface of it, the control he wore so consistently she'd almost stopped seeing it as a choice, shifted, and underneath it was something plain and unguarded and slightly afraid. The way real things are slightly afraid when they surface. Clara, he said. She waited. He looked at the table. I need to say something, and I need to say it plainly so there's no misunderstanding about what I mean. All right. You came here as my employee. You are still formally my employee. Everything that I've done in the last month was done because it was the right thing to do, and because the children, and because I would not have done otherwise, regardless of how I felt about it personally. He stopped. What I feel about it personally is a separate thing, and I'm aware that the timing of saying so is that you have just been through something significant, and the last thing I want is to... Nathaniel, Clara said. He looked up. I know what you're trying to say, she said, and I know why you're being careful about saying it. I want you to know that I've been watching you be careful about it for 3 weeks and I've been... She stopped. Her hands were still on the table. She looked at them. I've been trying to determine whether what I feel is real, or whether it's gratitude or relief, or the particular vulnerability of having been seen clearly by someone for the first time in a very long time. Have you determined it? She looked up at him. I think, she said carefully, that it is more than one of those things. I think it is real, and it is also gratitude, and it is also relief, and I'm not certain those things are required to be separate from each other. He was very still. What are you saying? I'm saying, Clara said with the precision she'd spent 4 years developing, that I would like to stay, not as your governess indefinitely. I'm saying that I would like the possibility of something different, eventually, when the time is right. She paused. I am also saying that I need time. I am still some mornings a woman who counts to 8 before she believes she's safe. I need you to understand that before anything else. I understand that, he said immediately. I'm not asking you to be anywhere other than where you are. I know you're not. She held his gaze. That's why I'm telling you this. The lamp between them burned steady. Outside, the August night was full of cricket sound, and the smell of the fields, and the Carter house was quiet, in a way that was full rather than empty, which was Clara had come to understand a significant distinction. All right, Nathaniel said. The word was simple and meant several things at once. All right, Clara agreed. The first morning in August, when Clara came downstairs and did not count to 8 before she believed herself safe, was a Thursday. She noticed it on the second stair from the bottom, the one that creaked. She noticed it because she'd already been on 3 stairs before she realized she hadn't counted, and she stood on the second from bottom stair for a moment, processing the absence of the habit, the way you notice a sound has stopped. She went to the kitchen, made coffee, stood at the window while it heated and looked at the morning, the fields, the early light, the general living fact of the Carter estate, going about the business of another day. She thought, I am here. I am 27 years old. I am a woman who kept a journal for 3 years and carried it for 4, and stood up in a county courtroom and used the exact words, and there are 7 women who found their way to my address, and 3 of them have now spoken with Marsh, and 2 of them are in the process of leaving, and 5 more letters came this week. She thought Lillian Cross wrote again yesterday to say she had found a room in Baltimore, and that she wasn't afraid anymore, and that she'd told her sister at last, and her sister had come. She thought Thomas got an arithmetic problem correct yesterday that he'd been fighting with for 2 weeks, and looked up at her with his father's gray eyes full of a pride he was trying not to show and failing completely. She thought Annabelle has decided that Clara's braid is a legitimate target for her opinions and has begun offering unsolicited styling suggestions every morning, and Clara has let her do it twice. She thought Nathaniel said all right last night, with the particular quality of a man who has just agreed to something he intends to mean, and he looked at her across the table, the way a surveyor looks at land he has decided is worth something, and then he went back to his accounts without making it into more than it was, and that restraint was its own kind of thing. She poured the coffee. She was in the kitchen when the side door opened, and Nathaniel came in from his early round of the grounds coat damp from the morning dew and stopped when he saw her. You're up early, he said. I didn't count, she said. He looked at her. The stairs, she said. I didn't count to 8. I didn't notice until I was already downstairs. He stood in the doorway for a moment. And then he did something she hadn't seen him do in 6 weeks of watching him carefully. He smiled. Not the managed surface expression she'd seen him deploy in company. A real one. Brief and slightly unsteady, the smile of a man who hadn't used the muscles for it in a while and found them more willing than expected. Good, he said. She held out the second cup she'd already poured. He came in, took it, sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and they drank their coffee in the morning quiet. And outside the fields went gold in the early light, and inside the Carter house. Something that had been absent for a long time was finding its way back in. The letter from Marsh arrived on a Friday in mid-August, and it changed things again, which Clara was beginning to understand was simply how things worked, not settled and done, but continually restlessly becoming. Marsh wrote that Whitfield's Philadelphia creditors, upon learning of the documented pattern and the failed Virginia case, had begun their own legal proceedings. That 2 of the women who'd written to Clara had retained counsel in their respective states. that the Richmond Enquirer had picked up the story more substantially. Not the brief notice, but a full account written by a correspondent who had apparently been at the hearing and had the specific instinct of a person who understood that what had happened in Harlan County on that gray Thursday morning was not a small thing. Marsh also wrote in the last paragraph, almost as an aside, "Word has reached me that Judge Alderman intends to cite the Harlan County proceedings as precedent in a case he's considering this fall. I thought you'd want to know." Clara read the letter at the breakfast table and then set it down and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Thomas, who had not outgrown the habit of watching her, said, "Good news or complicated news?" "Both," she said. "Those are usually the same thing," he said with the certainty of a boy who had learned this early and on good authority. "Yes," she said, "they are." She passed the letter to Nathaniel, who read it and set it down and said nothing immediately. He had learned she'd noticed the specific value of silence in moments like this. Not the absence of response, but the presence of it, the deliberate patient giving of space before speaking. "Precedent," he said finally. "Yes, that's—" He stopped, looked at her. "That's larger than you came here planning for." "I know." "Does it change what you want?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. What had she come here planning for? For she'd come here, planning to survive. To be useful. To get far enough from Gerald Whitfield that she could breathe without counting. She'd come here planning the absolute minimum of what a life required, because 4 years of running had narrowed her sense of what was possible to the diameter of a door she could slip through quickly. "No," she said. "It changes what's possible, not what I want." He looked at her. "What do you want?" She met his eyes. "This," she said simply. "This is what I want." The word sat between them, with the weight of something finally and precisely said. This kitchen. These children. The 7 letters, and the ones still coming. The spare, steadily warming thing that had been growing in the back sitting room in the evenings. The sound of Annabelle singing upstairs, and Thomas conjugating things he used to throw ink at the wall to avoid. The feeling of the second stare, and the absence of counting. This. Nathaniel held her gaze for a long moment. His face did what it did now. Sometimes in these moments the surface of it went quiet, in a way that was not sealing off, but opening, which she'd learned to tell the difference between. "All right," he said, again, with the same quality as before, and it meant the same thing and more. It was Mrs. Aldridge who said what no one else had said on a Saturday morning when she and Clara were in the kitchen, and the men were in the fields, and the children were in the garden. She looked up from her work and said without preamble, "He's going to ask you." Clara kept working. "I know," she said. And I'm going to need time. I told him that." "What did he say?" "He said he wasn't asking me to be anywhere other than where I am." Mrs. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Eleanor would have liked you." Clara looked up. "I knew her for 11 years, Mrs. Aldridge said. She was a woman who said the direct thing and expected the direct thing back, and she couldn't stand men who talked around what they meant. She would have found you refreshing." She paused. She worried in those last months about him. Not about herself. About him and the children after. She said to me once that she hoped he would remember how to let someone in again. She picked up her work. "I thought you should know that." Clara looked at her hands for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more ways than she could count. "Don't thank me," Mrs. Aldridge said, with the same cadence as Mrs. Harlowe's parting shot at the church steps. "Just don't leave." Clara almost smiled. "I'm not leaving." "Good," said Mrs. Aldridge, and that was that. The last letter of August arrived on a Monday, and it was not from a woman she didn't know. It was from Dorothea Haynes in Philadelphia, who had signed her name to the statement about clumsiness, who had been the first witness Marsh had found, whose letter had been read aloud in the courtroom on a gray Thursday morning, while a room full of people went very quiet. Dorothea Haynes wrote that she had read the full account in the Richmond Enquirer. She wrote that she had passed it to 4 women she knew. She wrote that one of those women had already contacted Marsh. She wrote in the last lines of the letter, I have thought about you often since I signed that statement. I thought about the word I used, clumsiness, and how easily I accepted his explanation. I was not a brave woman that night. I am trying to be one now. I hope it is not too late for that to be worth something. I believe what you did in that courtroom was not just for yourself. I think you knew it wasn't. I think you planned it that way. And I think you are the bravest person I have met from a very safe distance. Clara folded the letter carefully and held it for a moment with both hands. Then she walked to the study and put it in the desk drawer with the others, and she stood in the study alone for a minute with her hand on the closed drawer. She thought of herself at 23, sitting on the floor of a room in Baltimore, with a trunk half packed and a journal under her arm, and a decision she wasn't ready to call a decision yet. She thought of the specific, concentrated fear of that woman. Not a different woman. The same woman 4 years younger and 4 years less equipped and 4 years less certain that the floor would hold her. She thought that woman did not know this room existed. She did not know Virginia or Harlan County or a gray-eyed man who poured tea without being asked. She did not know Thomas or Annabelle or Mrs. Aldridge or Mrs. Harlow, with her devastating public hand-pressing and her 4 friends in the third row. She did not know that the floor would hold. But she'd kept the journal anyway. She'd carried it for 4 years anyway. She'd chosen it again and again in Baltimore and Philadelphia, and on a hired coach heading south to stay alive, and stay present, and stay, despite everything herself. Clara took her hand off the drawer. She opened the study door and walked back into the house, where the children were coming in from the garden, muddy and loud and full of the day's accumulated urgency, and Nathaniel was coming down the hall from the back, and Mrs. Aldridge was calling from the kitchen. That supper was nearly ready, and the Carter estate in the last week of August was exactly as loud and ordinary and alive as a house ought to be. Clara walked into the middle of all of it and stayed there. September arrived in Harlan County, the way good things sometimes arrived quietly without announcement, slipping in behind the last days of August while no one was looking. The brutal heat broke in the first week, traded for something cooler and cleaner that moved through the Carter house at night and made the mornings feel like a different season entirely, which they were. Clara noticed the change on a Tuesday. She'd opened her bedroom window before dressing and stood for a moment with her hands on the sill, feeling the air on her face, and realized she'd done it without thinking. Not the careful, deliberate opening of a woman who'd trained herself to check what was outside before she put herself near an opening. Just opened the window, because the morning was cool and she wanted to feel it. She stood there for a moment with that fact. Then she got dressed and went downstairs, and Annabelle was already at the breakfast table, explaining to a very patient Mrs. Aldridge why the month of September ought to be renamed something more interesting. And Thomas was reading at the table with one hand in his hair, the way he did when he was genuinely absorbed, and Nathaniel was coming through the side door from his morning round with his coat over his arm and mud on his boots, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and whatever Mrs. Aldridge had in the oven, and Clara walked into all of it and felt with a specificity that surprised her that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. September, Annabelle was saying with great conviction, should be called Golden Month because of the fields. That is not how months get their names, Thomas said without looking up from his book. It should be, Annabelle said. Miss Clara. Thomas looked up at Clara with the expression of a boy appealing to authority. Tell her that is not how months get their names. That is not how months get their names, Clara said, sitting down and accepting the coffee Mrs. Aldridge placed in front of her. However, she added before Annabelle's face could fully compose itself into disappointment, Golden Month is an excellent name, and I think you should keep it for personal use. Annabelle brightened immediately. I will, she said. I'll use it always. Golden Month, and then Harvest Month, and then Cold Month. You've renamed the entire year, Thomas said. I've improved it, Annabelle corrected. Nathaniel sat down at the head of the table and looked at the exchange with the expression Clara had been watching develop for 2 months. Not the managed surface, not the careful control, but something quieter and more present. The expression of a man who had remembered that his house was supposed to sound like this, and was no longer keeping himself at a distance from that fact. He caught her looking and held it for a moment, and she didn't look away. And that too was something new. The comfortable, undefended quality of being seen without bracing for what came after the seeing. The letter from Marsh came that same Tuesday afternoon, and it was the kind of letter that changed the temperature of a room. Marsh had written in his careful attorney's hand, but the language beneath the precision was the language of a man who had been surprised by something he hadn't fully anticipated when he'd taken this case. He wrote that Whitfield's Philadelphia creditors had formally filed suit. He wrote that 2 of the 7 women who'd contacted Clara had successfully obtained protective orders in their respective states, citing the Harlan County proceedings as precedent. He wrote that the Richmond Enquirer piece had been reprinted in 2 Philadelphia papers and 1 Boston publication. And then in the 3rd paragraph, the thing that changed the temperature. I have been contacted by a colleague in Philadelphia who represents the interests of Gerald Whitfield's primary creditor. He has informed me that Whitfield, in an attempt to satisfy his outstanding debts, has disclosed certain financial arrangements which have come to legal attention. Specifically, the management of your dowry assets during the marriage, which were never formally transferred, as he led you to believe, has been subject to review. Miss Bennett, the short version is this: there is money, your money, held improperly in accounts that were never legally converted to marital property. My colleague estimates the sum at approximately $4,000. Clara read the paragraph twice. Then she read it a 3rd time. She set the letter on the desk and pressed both palms flat on the surface and breathed through what was happening in her chest, which was complicated and several things at once, and not any of the things she would have predicted. $4,000. Her father's money. The money that had been the reason Gerald had married her, and the reason he'd spent 3 years pretending the paperwork would be handled properly when the time was right. The money she had long since grieved as gone. Had written off as the cost of surviving, had stopped thinking about, because thinking about it served no useful purpose when the primary concern was staying alive. She picked up the letter and walked to the study and knocked. "Come in," Nathaniel said. She set the letter on his desk and watched him read it. She watched his face do the small, precise changes that it did when he was processing something. The slight tension at the jaw, the particular stillness of the eyes, and then the controlled, deliberate settling as he reached a conclusion. He looked up. $4,000, he said. Yes. That's... He stopped. That's not a small amount. No. She looked at the letter. It's enough to do something with. It's enough to I could open a school. She said it the way you say a thing you've been thinking for longer than you realize, the way it comes out already formed, rather than forming as you speak. There are women who write to me now, Nathaniel. Women who leave and have nowhere to go, no way to earn, no skill the world will pay them for. A school, a proper school, not just for children, for women who need what? Miss Arden gave me at 12. The understanding that education is options. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. In Harlan County, he said. I don't know yet. Possibly, she met his eyes. I know this changes things. The money changes things. I want you to understand that my reasons for being here are not... Clara. His voice was very quiet. I know that. I need to say it anyway. Say it then. My reasons for wanting to stay have nothing to do with $4,000, or a school, or any practical arrangement. She held his gaze with the directness that had taken her 4 years to build back into herself. The thing she'd had before Gerald Whitfield had systematically dismantled it, and that she had reconstructed piece by piece in Baltimore and Philadelphia, and on a hired coach headed south, and in this house, in this kitchen, on these stairs. My reasons for wanting to stay are about this house and those children and you. That's all. Nathaniel stood up from the desk. He came around it and stood in front of her and looked at her with the full, unmanaged attention of a man who had stopped performing his own stillness and was simply still, present, decided. The school, he said, is an excellent idea. We'll talk to Marsh about the money this week. He paused. And the other thing, he stopped. His jaw worked slightly, the tell she'd learned to read. I told you I wasn't going to rush you. You're not rushing me, Clara. You're not, she said. I told you I needed time. I've had time. I've had 6 weeks of morning coffee and evening conversations, and watching you be a better father than you believe yourself to be, and I have... She stopped. I've been inside my own counting for so long that I forgot what it felt like to be inside something else. And I am inside something else now, and it feels... She pressed her lips together for a moment. It feels like the floor is holding. He looked at her. His face was entirely open, which was not an expression she'd seen from him in 2 months of watching carefully. Not managed, not controlled, not the careful presentation of a sealed man. Just open, slightly afraid, real. "What are you saying?" he said, which was what he'd asked her in August in the lamplight, and she gave him the same answer she'd given then and meant it more. "I'm saying I'd like to stay," she said. "Not as your governess. As..." She looked at him steadily. "As something worth more than that." He took a breath. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." He reached out and took her hand. Not the fingertips, the full hand, like Marsh had shaken it on the first day, like a person being recognized rather than held, and she let him, and her hand in his was entirely steady. Thomas found out on a Wednesday. He found out because he was Thomas, which meant he had been paying attention and connecting observations for several weeks, and had arrived at his own conclusion approximately 10 days before anyone said anything to him directly. When Nathaniel sat down with both children in the front sitting room and explained carefully and plainly that Miss Clara was going to stay not as their governess, but as a permanent member of the family. Thomas looked at his father and said, "I know." Nathaniel looked at him. "You know." "I've known for a while." He paused. "Annabelle doesn't know. She thinks Miss Clara is staying because she likes Annabelle's stories, which is also true," he added with the fairness of a boy who believed in accurate accounting. "But it's not the only reason." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "It's not." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He had his father's way of processing the still careful consideration before speaking, the conclusion coming out already complete. "She makes the house sound different," he said. "Since she came. It sounds like it used to." He looked at his father. "That's good. I want you to know I think it's good." Nathaniel looked at his son for a moment with an expression Clara, watching from the doorway, had not seen on his face before, the expression of a man being moved and choosing not to hide it. "Thank you, Thomas," he said. "You're welcome," Thomas said with the solemn simplicity of a boy who had said the thing he'd decided to say and meant every word of it. Annabelle, who had been waiting with the specific impatience of a 6-year-old, sitting through a conversation she didn't fully understand, said, "Does this mean Miss Clara gets a different room? Because if she moves to the green room, the window is bigger, and she could have the window box I've been planning. I've been planning it for 2 months." "2 months?" Clara said from the doorway. Annabelle turned around. "You were listening?" "I was," Clara said. "Good," Annabelle said with complete satisfaction. "Then you already know about the window box. I'm going to plant lavender, because you smell like lavender, and it will be appropriate." She paused. "Can I put some rosemary in too? Mrs. Aldridge says rosemary is for remembrance." Clara's throat tightened. She crossed the room and crouched down in front of Annabelle and looked at this small, precise, enormous-hearted child. "Yes," she said. "Rosemary too." Annabelle patted her cheek once the way she did, as though confirming something, and then climbed off the settee and went to find Mrs. Aldridge to report the good news about the window box. Thomas watched her go, then looked back at Clara with his gray eyes and said simply, "Welcome home." Clara Bennett had not cried properly in 3 years. She'd established earlier that the machinery for it might be broken. She was now discovering that it was not broken. It had simply been waiting for the right moment, and Thomas Carter had just provided it. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. Nathaniel, sitting across the room, did not say anything. He simply stayed where he was, which was exactly right. The news moved through the county with the particular velocity of a thing people had in some sense been expecting. Mrs. Harlow sent a note that consisted of 3 sentences. "I expected this. I am pleased. Come to tea Thursday and bring Nathaniel." Mrs. Patterson stopped by on a Friday with preserves and the bright, slightly tearful warmth of a woman who had been waiting to feel good about something for a long time and had found it. The man who'd turned away at church in July came by the estate on an errand that didn't strictly require an errand, and told Nathaniel he was glad things had worked out in the awkward, earnest way of a man trying to correct for an earlier cowardice. Nathaniel accepted this with the same equanimity he applied to most things direct, without embellishment. The nod of a man who didn't require elaborate repair to forgive a moderate failing. Clara watched this from across the yard and thought this is also part of what it means to belong to a place. The complicated, imperfect, always adjusting business of being in a community that had looked away and was now looking back. She'd spent 4 years moving before any of that could develop. She'd spent 4 years being the person who left before the leaving was done to her. She wasn't going to be that person anymore. The twist came, as the significant ones always do, from a direction she hadn't been watching. It came in the form of a letter from Marsh, in the 3rd week of September, delivered on a Tuesday morning, and it was addressed not to Clara, but to Nathaniel. She knew something significant was in it from the way Nathaniel read it, the particular quality of his stillness, the version of it that meant active processing rather than simple calm. He read it twice and then looked up and said, "Come sit down." She sat down. He put the letter on the table between them. It was from Marsh, but it was relaying information from Marsh's Philadelphia colleague. Whitfield's creditor proceedings had uncovered something in the account reviews, something beyond the dowry funds, something that had been buried in the estate accounts with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been hiding it for years. Gerald Whitfield had a daughter, not with Clara, before Clara. A child born in 1809 to a woman named Helen Marsh, no relation to the attorney who had died in childbirth, and whose daughter, a girl now 8 years old, named Frances, had been placed with a relative in Connecticut and supported by a monthly allowance from Whitfield's accounts that had been recorded in the estate books under an inventory line labeled Miscellaneous Property Maintenance. A child recorded as property maintenance, hidden in Connecticut for 8 years. Clara read the letter and set it down and was quiet for a long time. "He hid her," she said. "Yes. Because a child would have complicated the picture. The respectable widower seeking to recover his abandoned wife." She looked at the table. "She's 8 years old, the same age as Thomas." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Where is she now?" "Still in Connecticut, as far as Marsh knows, with a cousin of Helen Marsh's who has apparently been raising her without additional contact from Whitfield since the allowance stopped when his accounts were frozen." Clara looked at the letter. She thought of an 8-year-old girl in Connecticut who had been listed as miscellaneous property maintenance. She thought of Thomas on the second-to-last stair, telling her he was glad she hadn't left. She thought of Annabelle, and the window box, and the rosemary that was for remembrance. "What happens to her?" she said. "That's what Marsh is asking," Nathaniel said. He was watching her carefully. "The cousin cannot continue to support her without the allowance. Whitfield's assets are frozen. There is no other family on record." The room was very quiet. "Nathaniel," Clara said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not going to ask you to." "You're not asking," he said. "I'm telling you I've already thought about it." He held her gaze. "I know what it is to be a child whose circumstances were arranged by adults who should have done better. My children know it. And I know what you believe about what people are worth, and how that worth is not determined by what was done to them or what was decided on their behalf before they were old enough to have a say." Clara's chest felt too full for the space it occupied. "She's a child," she said. "She's a child," he agreed. "She needs somewhere to land." "Yes," he said. "She does." Clara looked at the letter for another moment. Then she looked at Nathaniel. This man who had stood at the top of his front steps and said he knows, and meant it as a declaration, who had poured tea in the dark and positioned himself at doors and said, "I've known 3 kinds of courage," with the plainness of a man stating a fact. This man who had learned in the month she'd been here to let the surface of himself be less than completely sealed. "Write to Marsh," she said. Howe was already reaching for the paper. The answer came back in 10 days, which was fast for legal arrangements, which meant Marsh had moved with the urgency of a man who understood what was at stake. The cousin in Connecticut, a woman named Lydia Marsh, had been caring for Frances for 3 years, with dwindling resources and increasing worry. And when the letter arrived from Henry Marsh in Harlan County, she had, according to the account relayed back, read it twice, and then sat down and wept with the particular quality of a woman being relieved of a weight she'd been carrying past her capacity. Frances Whitfield. She would not keep that name. Clara decided immediately, and said so, and Nathaniel agreed immediately, and the question of what name she would have was set aside for Frances herself. To have an opinion about when she arrived was described by Lydia as small for her age, very quiet, fond of drawing, and possessed of her mother's dark eyes, and the particular watchful quality of a child who had learned early to read the adults around her for information about her own safety. Clara read that description and recognized something in it so precisely that she had to set the letter down for a moment. She picked it back up, finished reading. She went to find Nathaniel. He was in the study, which was where he usually was at that hour, and she knocked and came in and sat down across from him and said, "She watches people, to know if she's safe." He looked up. "Lydia says she watches people to know if she's safe," Clara said. "She's 8 years old and she's already learned to read rooms." Nathaniel set down his pen. "When can she come?" Clara said. "Marsh says 2 weeks," Nathaniel said. "If we confirm." "Confirm it," Clara said. He looked at her for a moment, the long, direct surveying look, the one that saw rather than assessed. "You understand," he said carefully, that this changes the shape of things considerably. She is a child who needs somewhere to land," Clara said. "And I know what that is. I know what it is to be a person counting on the floor to hold." She looked at him. "Confirm it, Nathaniel." He picked up his pen. "All right," he said. Thomas was told on a Sunday. He received the information with the characteristic Carter stillness, processed it for approximately 45 seconds, and then said, "Is she going to want to use the schoolroom?" "Yes," Clara said. "Is she good at arithmetic?" "I have no idea. I'll help her if she's not," Thomas said with the matter-of-fact generosity of a child who had learned from a certain governess who had come in June that the generous offer was simply the right move. "Annabelle's getting better. I've been helping her. I can help too." "That's very kind of you, Thomas. It's practical," he said, which was exactly what his father would have said, and Clara pressed her lips together against a smile and agreed that yes, it was practical, and Thomas went back to his book with the squared shoulders of a boy who had decided about something. Annabelle's response to the news involved immediate and detailed logistical planning about which carved animal Frances would be given first, and whether the window box could fit lavender rosemary, and potentially one more thing that was yet to be determined. She had questions. She had many questions. Clara answered them all with the patience of a woman who had spent 6 weeks answering questions from a 6-year-old, and found to her own continuous surprise that she had not yet reached the bottom of her patience for it. Jaten. Frances arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early October, in a hired coach from the Richmond Road with a single trunk and a brown canvas bag held close against her body. Clara saw the bag and felt something move through her chest like a key in a lock. She came down the front steps alone. She'd asked everyone else to stay inside, to give the child a moment before she was overwhelmed, and walked to the coach and waited. Frances came out of the coach with the careful measuring quality that Lydia had described taking in the house and the grounds, and the woman at the bottom of the steps with the systematic efficiency of a small person, cataloging information relevant to her safety. She was small for 8, dark-eyed with her mother's face, and something around the eyes that Clara couldn't yet name but recognized. She looked at Clara. Clara looked at her. "Hello, Frances," Clara said. "My name is Clara. I'm very glad you're here." Frances looked at her for a long moment with those watchful, careful eyes. "Is it safe here?" Frances asked. Directly, plainly. The question of a child who had learned that the direct question was more reliable than the slow accumulation of guessed-at information. Clara crouched down to her level. "Yes," she said. "It is." "How do you know?" "Because I asked the same question when I arrived," Clara said. "And I've been here long enough to know the answer." Frances looked at her for another moment. Then she looked at the house. Then she looked back at Clara. "All right," she said. 2 words. Simple. The same words Nathaniel used for the things that mattered, and Clara heard the echo of them and felt the floor hold under all of it. She stood up. She held out her hand, and Frances looked at it, and then took it, the full hand, not the fingertips, and they walked up the front steps together. By November, the Carter house had reconfigured itself around the new shape of its occupants in the way that houses do when the people inside them are actually living, rather than simply existing in the same space. Frances had not kept the name Whitfield. She'd thought about it for 2 weeks with the serious deliberateness of an 8-year-old who understood the weight of the decision, and she'd come to Clara one morning and said, "Could I be Frances Bennett? Because you're Miss Bennett, and I'd like to belong to someone." Clara had sat very still for a moment. "Yes," she said, "you could be Frances Bennett. And later maybe something else," Frances said, practical as Thomas. "But for now, Bennett." "For now, Bennett," Clara agreed. She told Nathaniel that evening in the back sitting room in the hour after the children were in bed that had become formally without announcement, simply by accumulation their hour. She told him what Frances had said, and he looked at the lamp on the table for a moment, with the expression that was not sealed and not performed, but simply present the expression she'd been watching develop since June. "For now, Bennett," he repeated. "Yes. And later." He stopped, looked at her. "Clara, I have been patient." "You have," she said. "I told you I wasn't going to rush you." "You told me that," she agreed. "And I meant it." He held her gaze. "I mean it now still. But I want you to know, I want to say clearly, so there is no confusion about what I mean, that I intend to ask you a question. Not tonight necessarily, if tonight isn't right, but soon. And I want you to be thinking about your answer." Clara looked at him across the lamp. She thought of the second stare. She thought of opening the window without counting. She thought of Frances's hand in hers, the full hand, the weight of it, and the floor holding under all of it. "I've been thinking about it since August," she said. Something in his face opened. And, she said, "I would not have told Frances she could be a Bennett if I hadn't already decided what I was going to say when you asked." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp between them was very steady. "All right," he said. This time the word was different, quieter, deeper. The word of a man for whom all right had become the way he said the things too large for the usual language. "All right," she said back. He asked on a Saturday in late November. He asked in the kitchen at the table where they'd first sat across from each other at 3 in the morning, with a storm coming in, where she'd told him she wasn't in immediate danger, and he'd accepted that and stayed anyway. He asked without ceremony, without the performance of the occasion, in the plain direct way of a man who had learned that the things worth saying were best said simply. She said yes with the same plainness. And it was the truest thing she'd said since she'd walked into a courtroom in July and used the exact words. Mrs. Aldridge, who had been in the next room and not eavesdropping in any technical sense, came through the door 30 seconds later with the completely unsurprised expression of a woman who had been waiting for this since approximately the second Thursday of June, set a plate of something warm on the table between them, and went back out without a word. From upstairs, for no reason that seemed connected to the events in the kitchen, Annabelle began singing. By the following spring, the Carter estate had changed in ways that were visible if you knew where to look, and invisible if you only looked at the surface. Nathaniel Carter was not the sealed cold man his neighbors had quietly pitied and politely avoided for 2 years. He was still precise, still direct, still the most organized man in Harlan County. But the organization had warmth in it. Now the warmth of a man who had remembered that efficiency and care were not opposites, and could inhabit the same life without contradiction. Thomas was 9, and he tutored Frances in arithmetic with the brisk, competent generosity of a boy who had decided this was his contribution and intended to execute it correctly. He had stopped throwing anything at walls which Mrs. Aldridge occasionally brought up with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting to report this milestone for a long time. Annabelle was 7, and she had named every month of the year and was working on the seasons. The window box had lavender and rosemary, and ultimately a small, sprawling mint that had not been part of the plan, but that Annabelle had found persuasive on short notice. The mint had opinions about its square footage. No one had been able to argue it back into its designated corner. Frances Bennett was 8, and she had stopped watching rooms the way she used to. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the slow, incremental way that trust builds in a child who has reason to test it carefully before leaning. She drew. She drew everything: the fields, the kitchen table, the carved wooden animals Annabelle had allocated to her with the authority of a child distributing a cherished collection. She drew Clara's hands once, and gave the drawing to her without comment, the gift of a child who expressed what she felt through the precision of what she noticed. Clara had put it in the desk drawer with the letters. The letters were still coming. Not 7, now 23, from 9 different states. Marsh had formally organized the referral system, and 2 of the women had now successfully completed their own legal proceedings, citing Harlan County precedent, and the school that Clara had said out loud in the study, on a Tuesday afternoon in August, was no longer an idea, but a building on the edge of the Carter property, with 4 students, 2 of them grown women learning to read. One of them a girl of 12, who had decided that mathematics was going to be her particular territory, and was pursuing it with the single-minded intensity of someone who had finally been given permission to want something. Mrs. Harlow had donated the land. Of course she had. Clara taught 3 mornings a week and managed the correspondence and worked with Marsh on the cases that came through and raised 3 children and shared a life with a man who poured tea without being asked and stood at doors and said, "All right," for the things that were too large for other words. She did not count to 8 in the mornings anymore. She noticed sometimes the absence of the counting, noticed it the way you notice a pain you've lived with for so long that its absence is its own kind of sensation, a new information. The body saying things are different now. She noticed it and let herself feel it, the full, complicated, not entirely simple feeling of a woman who had survived something and come out on the other side, not unchanged, but not destroyed more herself. If anything, than she'd been before, because the parts of herself that Gerald Whitfield had systematically dismantled had been rebuilt in the rebuilding, and she'd had the choosing of each piece. She was still the woman who had sat on a Baltimore floor with a packed trunk and a journal under her arm and not quite made the decision yet. She was still the woman who had counted stairs and watched exits and made herself small in the kitchen at 3 in the morning. She would always be those women. They were not separate from her, not something to recover from, as though they'd been illness rather than experience. But she was also Clara Bennett Carter, standing in a schoolroom in Harlan County in the spring of 1818 with chalk dust on her hands and 3 letters from women she'd never met, who had found her address through a notice in a Philadelphia newspaper and outside the window. Annabelle was arguing with a mint plant about territorial boundaries, and inside the kitchen, Mrs. Aldridge was making something that smelled like the best version of an ordinary Tuesday. And down the hall, Frances was drawing something at the table with the focused stillness of a child who had been given permission to pay attention to beautiful things. And in the study, Nathaniel was at his desk, and when Clara walked past the open door, he looked up, and they exchanged the particular look of 2 people who have built something together and know the value of what they built because they know what it cost. She kept walking. She had a class in 20 minutes. The floor held. The floor held completely, and it held for all of them. And in the spring of 1818, in Harlan County, Virginia, on a Tuesday that smelled like coffee and chalk and Annabelle's embattled mint, Clara Bennett Carter stood in the life she had chosen and felt with the full precision of a woman who had learned to be exact about the things that mattered. She was home. She had been worth protecting. And she had protected herself first, which was the thing that made all the rest of it possible. That was the whole truth, and she knew every word